subquery, it's the same as a relationship so we're doing a relationship query. If it's a subquery, we're going to use another select statement. Okay, and then where do we find out where this API name is? Where do we get this name?
Child relationship.
Yep, that's the child relationship name. So there are lots of tools you can use to get that. But just a reminder to get this, because we know that we would like to query quote lines, we go onto the quote line, we find the field that we want to use for our relationship, and we can open the field and it will show us the child relationship name, but it won't show the __r or the namespace. As a developer, you just have to know that if it's a custom field that you create, then there's no namespace. But if the field was created as part of a managed package, then you have to include the namespace. Also, we haven't really talked about this, but some customers might have a namespace in their own org. So Salesforce allows you to create a namespace for your own org if you want to. But even if you have a namespace defined, when you're writing code, you can refer to the namespace, but you're not required to refer to the namespace. Okay. I generally don't see that, but if you're creating a managed package, then you're required to create a namespace. But you can create one even without that. Okay. All right, so we're going to be working with queries and relationships and things throughout various other topics. All right, so can everybody go and open the Salesforce UI? Okay. All right, does everybody see the search at the very top of the Salesforce window? Yep. Does anybody use that?
No.
No, okay. So let's go ahead and type in the word trucking. Trucking. Okay. Okay. So let's think about this from a code perspective. We're using SOQL queries. What would we have to do to replace, let's say we want to build the same page, but the custom version. Okay, what are the things that would be required? A, how many queries would we need?
3 queries.
Right, probably 3. The thing about the search box is this works across any object. Okay, so in addition to SOQL, there's another query language called SOSL, S-O-S-L. Okay, this uses something like Elasticsearch or something behind the scenes. So this can search across all the results. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the developer console, and I'm going to walk you through the syntax of a basic query here. Okay, all right. So go to your query editor. I've already typed something in here. This is the most basic version of the query. So we're going to type find, and then in curly brackets, we're going to type in the search term. Okay, trucking. Go ahead and click execute. Okay. And notice that we generally get the same results as what Salesforce provided. Okay, so find trucking.
Those are keys, right? Find, and then it's a key, not a bracket. And then there is a
Curly bracket. Curly bracket. All right, so
What are those IDs?
okay. These are the IDs for opportunity. These are the IDs for quote.
Yeah, I didn't notice the tabs.
Okay. So one other option that we have. So you guys can just watch on the screen for this part. Okay. So one other option that you have is you can say that you want to return only specific objects, and you can return specific fields on those objects. Okay. Is it broken?
I can close the curly
Me
brace.
neither. I don't know why.
Maybe I can type it anywhere else and copy and paste it.
I copy and
Yeah.
pasted it.
You can't also?
No, I did. So I don't know what's going on. User error.
No, I think it's a hotkey, a combination of keys that is clearing the tabs.
So LGR that I have here to do curly braces is doing something else. It's like allowed in the developer console
Oh, it is your,
in Spanish.
okay, so your keyboard is different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
guys.
Yeah,
Because for curly brace I have to use the right alt.
Okay. Okay.
turning.
So this is Sasso. We're not going to spend too much time in Sasso. We're going to look at the documentation. You end up not using this very often on projects, but if there are situations where you might need to provide a very custom search page, Sasso is a better option. So let's go ahead and pull up the documentation for this. Okay. So if you type in, I don't even know what I typed. This is already on this page. If you just type into Google Apex Sasso or Salesforce Sasso, which is SOSL, it's the same page that we looked at for the relationship queries earlier. Just further down on the page, we have Sasso. Okay. Okay. Is everyone able to find this?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the syntax for this is a little bit different than SOCL, and sometimes you'll see examples here that work in the developer console, but if you're in Apex, maybe they're a little bit different. Okay. Okay. So I'm on this example text searches. So you might need to scroll down. So first you might need to click on this item up here, and then the sub item will come up. Okay, so you might need to click here first. It'll probably be at the very bottom. Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through these examples here, and then we're going to move on to a new topic. Okay. I just wanted to give you guys exposure so that if you have a use case where you need this, you can come read the documentation and learn it on your own. All right. So this is the syntax that we used just now, where we typed in trucking, and this is a similar search to what we did. So in this one, it says we're going to find the text to Joe Smith. We only want to look in the name field. We don't want to look across every field, just the name field. And then we only want to return the lead object, and these are the fields that we would like to return. Okay. So let's. Okay. All right. So when I search for find trucking, notice up here we have these tabs. So what do you guys think would happen if we were in Apex and we did find trucking? What data type would we get back?
Set, yeah, map, maybe. No.
Oh, list.
A map of
List of
Okay, so we would, so opportunity, we have a list of S objects, but we also have a list of quotes and a list of accounts.
A list of lists.
Yes.
list.
Yes, a list of lists of S objects. Okay, so when you're working with it, it's not too difficult to work with. You just have a complex data type. So, okay. You can also add some simple where conditions here. Okay, in this case, I don't know if you guys remember when I showed you FuseKit on the very first day. I showed you that working with dates, we could do things like less than yesterday or equal to something. So they're using, it's called date literal. They're using that here. You also have the ability to use some wildcards to be a little bit more specific. So in this case, we're using escaping. We can use wildcards here if you want to find more broad searches. Okay. I'm not going to go through all these things. I just wanted, again, I wanted to give you guys some exposure to this. Okay. All right, so what we're going to do is, I think we're probably already good here. Let's talk about working with S objects, about creating records. Okay. Sometimes this can be a little bit confusing to begin with. Okay, actually everybody go to, let's go to Salesforce. We're going to go to the account fields. We're going to add a new custom field on the account. Okay, new custom field on the account. Okay, we're going to add a formula field. Okay. Okay. We're going to add a formula field, and let's do. I'm trying to think of a good example. Can anyone think of a good example for a formula field? You guys haven't really worked with formula fields. Yeah. Just an example so we can work with it. Okay, we can do date or date time.
Mix the account name with the date of creation.
Okay. We can try it. All right, account name. All right, let's choose. I wish I had an example in my mind. I'm sorry. Let me look at these and see what we can do here.
Account name plus email. Well, we don't have an email, but we can figure it out.
Okay, we'll do the account name and the type. Okay, we'll add those together. So, all right, so we're going to say, now we have to think of a name.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll just say account identifier. Okay. Doesn't mean anything. Okay, we're going to choose text. Okay, so the reason we're creating this formula field is just so that we can see what working with formula fields is like and prove a couple of concepts that you might run into when you're writing code. Okay, so we're on the account object. We created a new formula field. It's called account identifier. It's of type text. Okay, now on the next page, make sure that you're on the advanced editor. Advanced editor. Okay. All right, and from here, what we're going to do is we're going to, you can use this insert field if you want. This will show all the fields. This shows them by label. So if we took the account name, if you already know what the API name is, you can just type it in. And then we're going to use ampersand. And then we're going to, let's put a space in between those. And then the other one was type. So that works. Here's a good error message. You'll get this once in a while. Okay. Right. So type is a pick list. So what we have to do is we have to use the text function. Yep. To just say, give me the text value. You might also see the isPickVal. If you need to check if a pick list equals a certain value, then you might use isPickVal. Okay. All right, so make sure that when you type that in and you hit check syntax, that you get green text down here.
Sorry, why the text function?
Type is a pick list, so it's a drop-down list. Yep, and because it's a drop-down, I'm not sure the technical reasons, but they require that you cast that to a string, basically. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and choose next and then save. Keep hitting next until you get to the save. Okay. Great. All right, so we have this account identifier. Okay, just keep in mind that if for some reason you type this in differently, we're going to be using the API name, so you want to make sure you're using the right API name if yours is slightly different than mine. Okay. All right, so let's go back to Maven's Mate. We're going to create a new Apex class. Okay. We're going to call this one S Object Examples. Go ahead and hit create. S Object Examples. Okay. We're going to create a new method named create new account. All right, so if we're going to create a new account, what fields do you think we're going to be required to populate?
Name, ID. No, ID, no, sorry. Just name.
Just name, yes. Okay, so whatever we do in the UI, in Apex, we have the same restrictions. Okay, so let's just go ahead and create a new instance of an account object. So account. Okay, so right here we have a couple different options. So option number one is we can use this syntax, and then from here, we can specify that we want the name. Okay. All right, so this is option number one. Option number two is we can specify the name right in the constructor by passing in whatever the field name is equals and then whatever the value is.
Like a C#.
Okay, C# like that? Okay. We're doing the exact same thing. There's two options in how we interact with that data. All right. Does this data exist in the database?
No.
It's in memory.
Okay. Yep.
We need to.
It's just in memory. So let's go ahead and choose insert account. We'll go ahead and insert account and account two. Okay. What do you think is going to happen when we insert these? When we print this out to the console, what data is going to show?
ID.
Okay. Yes, it will be injected. The ID will be injected into our instance from the database. Anything else?
The name and the formula, because I don't know. Maybe the formula, I don't know what.
Okay.
No, because we don't define a type.
But maybe there is a default value. Yeah.
Okay. So let's go ahead and print out both of our things, our accounts. Okay.
When you do that, is that coming from memory or got the object updated from the database?
So our instance of our account will be updated with the ID. No other fields will be updated.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So and we'll go ahead and prove that in just a moment. So let's go to the anonymous debugger, run your code.
So this will be equivalent when in other languages you do the install and then you retrieve the instance so you can continue working on that object. In this case, this object becomes a valid member on say for instance.
Yes. Yes. So you can continue
I
working.
can update another field and then do an update and that is going to be updated to the proper instance.
Yes, you can continue to update multiple times if you want to. But we'll get into how the formula field works on that as well. Okay, so when we execute our code, and I'm going to close all these other tabs here. Okay, it's very slow. Whoops. I ran mine twice, so I'm going to have multiple accounts. All right. So what we can see is that what printed out, we have our ID, and then we also have the account name. All right, that's pretty basic. All right, so let's say that we want to update the account name. So let's go create another method. We'll require the user to pass in the ID. We'll query that account. We'll update the name, and then we can talk about how that interacts with our formula field. Okay. So let's say that public static void. Okay. So let's say that we want to update the account name. Let's say that we're going to require the account ID to be passed in, as well as the name of the account that we want the user to set that to. Okay. All right. So what's going to be my first step?
Retrieve the account.
Okay.
Find the account. ID.
Okay.
Yeah, you can use the ID here because it's supposed.
Yeah.
It
So
exists.
yep. So there's a couple of ways that we could go about this. So let me just make a note to myself. You guys will see. So remind me to come back to this comment. So what we could do is we can update the account without actually getting it from the database. But for this example, we're going to query from the database first. So what we want is we only want one account to be returned, right? Mm-hmm. So what we can do is instead of turning this into a list, we can have a query that returns, as long as it returns one record, Salesforce can unwrap that from a list and get the first element for us. So let's say that we want to select our ID, our name, and whatever that custom field was, the account identifier from account, where I'm going to make this multiple lines so you guys can see. Okay. What would the where clause be?
ID account ID.
So there's something here that now we want to use a variable in our query. The way that we tell the Apex engine that we want to use a variable is we need to put a colon in front of our variable name. Okay? Right? Now from here, we want to set our account.name equal to the account name variable. And then we want to update account. Okay. All right. What do you think is going to print out to the database? Do you have a question?
Use Observe.
Observe?
Observe, use observe. In this case, are the same that use date.
Sure. So, yeah, observe you would usually want to be on an external ID field, but you can use observe on the actual record ID. If you don't actually specify a key, then it will default to the ID. So you could use an observe here. And it would update, it would always update the record because the ID exists. But if for some reason it didn't, then it would create.
Exactly. Right. For the observe, you have to specify what field is the ID.
Yep.
That you
Yep. And we'll get into, we can do an observe example so you guys can have that.
Okay.
Okay? Yes.
If I create a new account and set the ID and the name and use the update,
What happened?
what happened? Have any problems?
Nope, that'll work, and I'll show that. We'll show that example. This comment here. I want to come back and show you how to do that. Okay. What do we think is going to print out? Let's add a debug statement here. We can copy the one from above as long as your variable name is the same. Okay. We know what ID is going to be. We know that name is going to update. What about account identifier?
It can't be modified.
Okay. Right. So we're not modifying it. But let's go look at an example. Let's run this. So make sure our code saves, and we'll work through how this works.
But we need to retrieve an account ID.
Yep. Yeah. So what we're going to do. So in our developer console, we're going to need to add an account ID. Okay. Yep. So go find an account ID in Salesforce. We're going to call this method. We're going to pass in the ID as just as a string on our method. Okay. And if we open this record from a Salso query, you notice that we get some extra query parameters up here. We don't need to worry about those. Okay. All right. So I'm going to update the name on this Trucking 101 account to I am updated. What do we think is going to happen when we log out our data to the console? Okay.
And now the formula.
Okay. Well, let's go run it. Let's find out.
Okay.
Okay. So I run it. I click debug. Okay. Notice that the account identifier still shows the old.
Yeah.
But if I come to Salesforce and I update, this is the correct value. Okay. So what happens is when you commit to the database, it does not recalculate all formula fields on your instance. If you need those to be recalculated, you have to requery your data so that you get the updated version. Okay? So those update in the background, but your instance, the only thing that will ever change on your instance is the ID field on an insert. Aside from that, nothing will ever change. Okay?
If the account ID doesn't exist.
If the account ID doesn't exist, then we will get an exception. So you guys can just watch. I will simulate that. Right. So A, it's an invalid ID. That was the first exception. But let's say that the ID is valid. Let's just say that let's say that I make that a K. Okay. So the error that we're getting here is saying that we tried to query this data, and whatever the results were, we tried to save that in this variable, but there was no results returned. So because this isn't a list, it'll throw an exception if there's no records returned. If this was a list, it would have just returned no records, and then we could have looped through it. Okay, so if you're not sure if you're guaranteed to get records back, always use the list syntax so you don't get an exception.
Thanks.
Okay, yep, you're welcome. All right, so let's go ahead and copy this method. Okay, let's put the number 2 at the end. Okay. So what we're going to do here, actually, let's name this. Let's change the name of our method. Instead of 2, we're going to put without query at the end. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So if we know what the ID of the record is, and we don't need to access any of that data, we can just create a new instance, set the ID field, and then we can perform an update. Okay, so we can just say ID equals count ID and name. Actually, we don't even need to, oh yeah, so we can just set name. We can just do this. Okay, so we can do all that inline here. Okay, because we're setting the ID, Salesforce will match that to the database query, or match that to the database record. All right. All right, so now if we run that method, all right, I'm going to set my name back to Trucking 201 just for fun. So now if I execute this, we notice that we got a success message. And if I refresh the page, we can see that, yes, indeed, our data was updated. Okay. So there's one thing we might be able to do. There is a method that Salesforce provides to us that's on the SObject class that will allow us to recalculate our formulas on our instance of our data, but it doesn't work if you have relationships in your data set. So it's pretty limited because you almost always end up having relationships. But we have this recalculate formulas method, so I'm going to try to run this. We'll see if it works. Okay. I'll put that here. All right, so now let's see if this worked. Okay, so I'm going to run this.
The recalculator use the database data or the memory data.
So that did work. So I'm not sure exactly how it works. I don't. Thing you can do whenever you do commands, you can come look at your limits. So you can see that the SOQL queries is 0. So it didn't count against us. So it probably did not have to go back to the database for that. I'm not sure exactly how Salesforce provides that. Okay, so just to review what I just went through, we called this recalculate formulas method. This is available on SObject, and because account inherits from SObject, this method is available. So if you remember up here, when we updated our record, the formula field still showed the old value, but when we ran this recalculate formulas, it forced those to recalculate on our instance. And we can see that the name that I just set was actually populated in the instance. Okay? All right, any questions on that? All right. Cool. Let's move into an insert, or I'm sorry, an upsert. Let's create another method. We're going to call this one upsert example. Okay. All right, so let's go into Salesforce. Let's go to your account fields. Let's create a new field. Okay. This field that we're creating needs to be of type text. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an external ID so that we can use that to upsert. Okay, an external ID, what this means is that this field is indexed in the database. It's not required to be unique, but if there are multiple records with the same value and you try to upsert, it will fail. So you probably do want to mark it as unique, but then if you try to clone a record, that will fail in the UI. So sometimes there's some trade-offs if you choose unique. So it just depends on your use case and what you're using the external ID for. Let's go ahead and hit next. Let's just name this Oracle account ID, right? So we're just hypothetical situation that this field is the Oracle account number, and so we know that's unique, and maybe we have access to that field more easily than we know what the Salesforce ID is. Okay, the next thing it asks us for is length. So we'll just go ahead and type in 60. And I highly recommend that everybody goes through the data modeling trailhead, talks about creating fields, and you'll learn a lot that is really critical information about how fields work. When you're a developer, you just need to know kind of all that stuff. Okay, so down here, we're just going to leave it as required false. Do not allow duplicate values. Let's not worry about that. And then external ID, make sure that you check this box so that it's marked as indexed in the database. Okay? External ID. What that means is that when we do an upsert, we'll be able to use this field. Okay, and then go ahead and hit next, and then save. Okay, and then go ahead and copy the API name to your clipboard so we can use that in our code. Okay, any questions? Anyone have any questions? Make sure that this checkbox here next to index is checked. Okay, and it says external ID here. If it doesn't, then you'll have to go edit your field and check that box. Okay. All right, so let's say that all right, let's go back to our Apex. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow the user to pass in the Oracle ID and also pass in the name, and we're going to go ahead and update the name on the account. Otherwise, we're going to create a brand new account. Okay? Okay, and in this case, okay, we're going to create an account instance. I might get the syntax wrong the first time, so we might run into an error. Apologize. All right, so we're going to create a new instance of our account where the name we're going to set equal to our name parameter that's passed in. Then we're going to use the upsert keyword. So what we're saying is we want to upsert our account, and we want to upsert. Actually, I'm pretty sure we need this field.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, make sure that your code saves. Okay, let's go ahead and run this example. What should we name the account? Someone draw a word.
This is an Oracle account.
I'll put a 1. All right. All right, so we're calling our upsert method. We're passing in the Oracle account ID. So what that says is, if a record exists in the database where the Oracle ID equals 123, update that record with this name. Otherwise, create a brand new record with this name. Okay? So if you're doing an upsert, you need to make sure that all your required fields are populated if you think that it's potentially going to create a new record. All right, so let's go ahead and execute this. No errors, that's good. You might want to log something out. I forgot that step. But either way, we can come in the Salesforce UI. We can click Accounts, and we can see that we have our new account.
No, pero yo cambié el nombre.
No, mira, el de ahí.
101.
Y le di. A ver.
Okay. Esto no es la
Sí. Es el mismo. Lo hicimos
All right. Once you see your account, go back to the developer console. Go ahead and change the name and run this again, and we can see that because we already have an account with the Oracle IDs 123, we're going to see that record updated instead of a brand new record created. Okay. So we can see that now this was updated, so because the Oracle account ID existed. So that's how an upsert works. Okay.
Does the upsert function use only one parameter to find the option? Or
Yes.
just one?
Uses either 0 or 1. Okay. So the available upsert options are you can use either exactly 1 or you can just say upsert account. And if that's the case, it will use the ID field. So yeah, this one, I'm sure there's a use case for it. I can't remember exactly what it is, but there's some use case where this would be useful to not specify anything. Okay. But
I think
I'm not
by
gonna,
default is the ID.
yes, the record ID, and I think you can use any index fields. I think you can also use the name field, but again, that's not forced to be unique. So you just have to know what data you're working with to make a good decision. Okay. All right, and then I just want to review a couple of other things, and then we're going to move on to triggers. Okay, so the database transaction, so DML, all of our options, we have insert, we have update, we have upsert, and then we have delete and undelete. Okay, when you delete a record, it goes to the recycle bin for 30 days. And so you can undelete that record at that point. Any of those transactions are considered database transactions and will cause a trigger to fire. So just for fun, if I delete this record, then what happens is it goes to the recycle bin. And over on the sidebar, there's this recycle bin, and this will show, I don't know why there's a lot of stuff here, but there's, I guess we deleted some stuff. Yep. So we have the option here to undelete. So this is using the same query. So there's, I forgot the exact syntax, but you can say like query all or add that keyword into your SOCL query if you want to get the deleted records. Okay. And if you're using the API, you may notice that there's a parameter, or maybe you noticed that when we opened up the account object in the dev console that was called isDeleted. So there's a parameter. So it's still in the database. They just hide it. So it's there for some time period. I think 30 days or something.
Is that always the case that it goes to recycle bin? Or like the case?
There might be a way to hard delete. I'm not sure.
Because I had a time when I was testing the campaign numbers and I executed an Apex retrieval queries of campaign numbers for the Subquery query, and it has deletes of that list.
Mm-hmm.
And then for some reason I tried to undelete them and couldn't find them.
You tried to go to the recycle bin or find them in code?
Yeah, it was the recycle bin didn't have them.
Okay, yeah, there might be some nuances there. I'm not 100% sure. So you might have to go research on your own. Sorry. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move into triggers. All right, triggers, the fastest way to break everything in your org. Okay, and we're gonna build on the account, so we're gonna try not to break anything. All right, so let's go ahead and start with a trigger and talk about how a trigger works and what the syntax is and all the things that we have available to us. So let's go Maven's Mate, metadata, but this time we're going to click on New Apex Trigger. Okay, and let me look at these templates really quickly. All right, let's go ahead and choose the template that says all events. Okay, then it's asking you to type in the name that you want your trigger to be called. This is really important here, okay? This is where the best practice comes in. We only want one trigger per object, never more than one. If you have more than one, there's no guarantee on the order that they will be fired in. So the best practice is always create your trigger, name it with the name of the object and the name so that any other developer can go, that's what they're expecting, so they can go see that. And then from there, none of your business logic should be in your trigger. That should all call out to a trigger handler or helper or some other class. There's a lot of ways to do that. But let's go ahead and get this started. Our object API name is going to be account. This is the API name of the S object. So if it was on quote, this would be SBQQ underscore underscore quote underscore underscore C. Go ahead and hit create. Okay. Okay. All right, so the way that a trigger is structured, so this might look a little bit weird at first, but if you look at it, all we've done here is we've said, so instead of class, we're using the keyword trigger. Then we say the name of the trigger, and the trigger is on the account object. And then in parentheses, we have a comma-separated list of all the trigger events, all the times this will be fired. So notice that we have before and after. What this means is that our code will be called before it hits the database or after it hits the database. And there's some nuance to what you can do in either situation and why you would use one over the other. Okay, so before, okay, if it's let's say we're creating a new account, we have a before insert trigger. The ID does not get added to our object until it hits the database. The database is what assigns that ID. So if we're before insert, we don't have that record ID. So if we need to if we need that ID for any reason, then we're not going to be able to access that. We would have to interact with that data after insert. Okay, so we have before insert, update, delete, undelete. Upsert doesn't exist because that will either turn into an update or turn into an insert. Okay, and then we have after. So afterwards, the ID will exist, but the instance of these after variables, so Salesforce is going to give us a list of all the objects. If it's after insert or after update, those instances are read-only. They're immutable. So you need to create new instances if you want to do any data manipulation. Before insert, that data is mutable, and if you change it, whatever you change will be the changed values that go into the database. Okay, so you can manipulate it. You don't need to do any DML statements because it's on its way to the database already, that exact instant, so it'll just go. Okay? And then let's say that we have a trigger that's after update. If we then modify that data again, we have to do another database transaction if we want to make another update to that record, which will start our trigger over again. Okay? So you want to be very conscious about what's happening, and maybe you need to add static variables to determine if your code is already run so that it only runs once. Maybe you want recursion, maybe you want it to run multiple times. Just keep that in mind. If you have queries in your trigger, you probably want some conditions to make sure the data is exactly like you want it to be before you do any queries. Okay. Also, so Salesforce provides us a list of objects, and they populate every field on the object. We don't have to specify fields. It's the full definition of the object, but there's no relationships. If you need any relationships, you have to query for that data. Okay. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some examples here. So there's a special object that is added to the context that's called trigger. So just like the system class, we have an object called trigger. So we have trigger.new, trigger.old. Okay. We're going to log these out in the console. Okay. All right, so we're going to wrap these in debug statements here in a minute, but I'll help you guys do that with some really fancy keyboard shortcuts. Okay. So this trigger object, there's a couple other items, but these are the main ones that you're going to use. Trigger.new, this will give you a list of all the records that are being sent to this trigger. So remember how we did an update on a list of accounts? Okay, so the term for that is bulkify. We bulkified our code. Okay, that means that we're just operating on things in bulk. A trigger will be called with up to 200 records per trigger context. Okay, that's really important to understand. So let's say that we created a quote, and let's say we were bulk adding through a data load lines. So our trigger will get called with 200 records at a time. So when our trigger is called, if we have dependencies where we need to look at every single quote line, just know that maybe some quote lines have not yet been created. So that can add some complexities around solving some use cases. You know, if you need to take some action where you have to sum up some values and set something else, you know, you can't assume that you will always have all your data. Okay. So trigger.new will be a list of the new records that are either about to go to the database or that were just inserted into the database. Trigger.new map. Any idea what this is? Okay. Trigger.new map is a map of the new objects with their ID as the key. Okay. Trigger.old. Any guesses?
And there is an update, there is something.
Yep, this is the old instance. Okay. Why this is really handy is because you can figure out if a specific field on a record was changed. You can look at that. Okay, so that's a really common use case where you might say, hey, when my opportunity stage is changed to closed one, then I want to run this code. Okay, so it's really common that you'll need to find out, because you don't want to have it run on every update if it's in closed one. You might only want to run it when it just goes into closed one from any other status. Okay, old map is the same. It just is a list of IDs. So generally what you'll use is you'll end up using trigger.new a lot, and you'll use trigger.oldMap. Because you have your list of new records, you're going to loop through those. And then for every record in the list, you can look at the old map. You know what the ID is here. You can grab the old version of that so that you don't have to loop through two lists. Okay? Trigger.isBefore and trigger.isAfter. These are just Boolean values that tell you if you're operating in the before context or the after context. Okay? And then up here, we have the option to only add the events we want to add. So for performance reasons, you should only add what the life cycle events that you care about. We're going to add everything in this example. Okay. All right, so if you can highlight these, okay, and if you can push Command or Control Shift L, that'll put a cursor around every single item. From here, you can either hit the home key or Command left arrow, and now we can type system.debug. Okay. So, and then if you can highlight everything, all right. That's why I like Sublime.
Yeah,
It's fast.
it's black.
Yeah, most of them, so Atom and VS Code have that also. So. I think IntelliJ has some version of that.
Yeah, I think it has something.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't used it very much, but it's like didn't quite work the same, so it's kind of annoying.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead and save. Hopefully we don't have any errors. Okay. All right. So remember what I said, whenever we open up the developer console, we automatically subscribe to logs. So this is a time when you're troubleshooting triggers. If you just open up the developer console, and then you can just interact with data however you want, either through code or through the UI, then you can come look at the logs from your trigger. So let's go into Salesforce. Let's go ahead and create a brand new account record. Okay, so click on the Accounts tab. Did anyone have a problem saving? Okay. Does anyone need me to show my code again?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody need help? Not yet. Just in time for triggers.
Is Justin's?
No.
Is there anyone that's not ready to move on? We're just logging out all the data. Just a couple of things.
I like triggers. Some magic happens.
This for like having this.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, is everybody ready? All right. Okay, does anyone need a hand? We're good? Okay. So everybody open up the Salesforce UI. Okay. All right, please navigate to the account object. We're going to create a new account. Make sure that your developer console is open. There will be a window that pops up that says resume. What happens is if you wait too long and you don't open it, it'll stop listening for changes. You want to make sure that it's active. Okay, we're going to go ahead and say create a new account. I'm going to my favorite one. What I always use in my training classes. Okay, I'll go ahead and add an Oracle account ID. Just for fun. All right, then we'll go ahead and click Save. Okay, so now our record is saved. We have a brand new account created. Let's go back into the developer console. We can see that we have a new log. Does anyone have an idea what this identifier is down here in our log?
The account. That means
The operation. Yeah.
So 001
is the prefix.
Yes, so that's on an ID, that's the prefix, and that's the prefix that's specific to an account. So if you have that prefix, you can actually call some metadata methods in Apex and figure out what object that's from. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and click on debug only. Double click on your log, then click debug only. Okay. All right, we have a lot of null values here, so let's walk through this. Okay. So trigger.new, this is a list of all of our accounts. Because we only inserted one account, we only have one account here in our trigger. It could have up to 200, at most 200. Okay, notice this has every single field, no matter what. Even if we didn't modify the field, it's going to include every field and that current value. If there's any formula fields, those will be up to date. Okay, trigger.new map is null. Any guesses why null?
There's no ID before the option.
Exactly. So if we go back to the diagram, the ID is added to our instance after it hits the database. Trigger.new map is a map where the ID is the key and the record is the value, but there's no ID, so there's no way that map can be populated with data. Okay, trigger.old, because this is an insert, there's no old version of this record. Otherwise, this would be the record before an update. We'll look at that one next. Okay, and then this tells us that trigger.isBefore is true, trigger.isAfter is false. Okay, so what's happening here is that the first half of our log is this, then it hits the database, then our trigger is called again because we subscribe to both the before and after. And at this point, the ID is now available. So now we have trigger.new map. Okay, because there's an ID, and notice that the ID field was populated and before it was null. And then the only other difference is this is before is false and the is after is true. Okay. So let's go through and let's change. Let's go through and change the name on our account in the UI. Okay.
I finally get it. I thought it's in my little penny. Oh no! I don't get it.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and add. I'm going to go ahead and add an industry here just for fun, so that our account identifier field updates. Oh, it's tight. Okay. Yeah, dropped. All right. So perform an update on your account, change the name or any other field, and let's go back and look at our logs. Okay. All right, we have a whole bunch more data here. So we have the new version of the record. So all that new means is this is the new instance of the data that's going to the database. It doesn't mean new as in it's being inserted. It's just the new version of the record that we're making changes to. We have the option to have that turn into a map. Then we have the old version. So go ahead and double click on the old version. Or actually, we don't need to double click, but we can see. Okay, notice that we see that we have on our new version, we have the new name, and on the old version, we have the old name. Okay. All right, and then we have the second time that it ran and the after context. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. This is a really powerful feature of the Salesforce platform, and it's really, really, really common that you would need to write a trigger to interact with some data. One of the more complex examples or situations because our trigger can be called with 200 unrelated accounts, that can make it really tricky. When, you know, like let's say that if it's called with 200 unrelated accounts and we need to do operations on all the quotes associated with those accounts, you know, I mean, think about what we have to do. We have to query the quotes. Maybe we can use relationship queries or subqueries, but there's a lot of data relationship that you might have to do. Okay. All right, let's go through some other examples here. So I'm going to show you a common pattern that I like to use with triggers. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to change this to use a trigger helper. So the pattern that I follow is a simple if statement. So I would say if trigger.isAfter, and oh, I forgot some lifecycle methods, and trigger.isInsert. Okay, I'm sorry, but we have an isInsert, isUpdate, isDelete, isUndelete. So those are other Boolean fields I forgot about the first time around. Okay. Oops, and I should do is before first. Okay, so so normally we'll have some list of ifs and else if statements that just figure out what context we're in, and then call to a helper class that says handle before insert, handle after insert. And that way, all your code for those operations, you'll know exactly when things are firing without, you know, without any confusion. Okay. So let's go ahead and do this just for insert and update.
Yeah. I was going to exactly.
Okay.
You do it that way or by using the signature on top to identify each trigger.
Okay, so normally what you would do is you would limit this to only the items that you need,
Okay.
but only use one trigger per object, no matter what, and then use this. So let's go ahead and choose Maven's Mate, metadata, new Apex class. Okay, we're going to create a new Apex class, and we're going to call this one account trigger helper. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and choose default. We're going to call this one account trigger helper. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to make 4 methods, 4 static methods, and we're going to say handle before insert, handle after insert, handle before update, handle after update. Okay.
Sorry if you explained it before, but yeah, it's because of a limitation that you put everything in one trigger.
Not because of a limitation, but because you don't have guarantees on when things fire. So it's just a best practice.
Okay.
These are one trigger per object.
One trigger per object. If you have one trigger that handles like insert, and then another one that
You
handles
can
update.
control by swapping the counts and the quotes there. That's the idea.
Yeah, so that is an option, but when other developers come in, they may not see that you have it's handled. So they might go to another trigger and they might add this there.
Yeah.
So just over time, that this is what everybody recommends to do, is just one trigger.
You still have the limitation of time then. So there's
Right.
going to be one execution for probably many actions.
Yeah, so generally you want to
wait,
limit.
depending on how many triggers you have.
So if you're only using before insert, you would want to have just this, and then over time add the other ones as you need them.
Okay.
So yeah, just to save on performance. Okay. So each one of these methods, generally, what I like to do.
Okay.
Yes.
What was the Maven's Mate class Apex? Yeah.
Account trigger helper.
Yes, but the API name and the template.
Nope,
what?
it's a new Apex class. Yeah, default template. Yeah, not trigger, but
Not
Apex
trigger.
class. Yep.
Okay.
If it's asking you for an object API name, then you probably want to trigger. Okay. And then these methods usually, okay, the trigger.new, that's a list of S object, but depending on which object we're operating on, it knows the type. So you can just use that type here. So I usually name my variables. I usually just handle the trigger.new and trigger.oldMap. Okay, so this is generally how I do my naming convention. Okay, actually before insert, this will be null, so we actually wouldn't have that. So. Practice. What? So do I have any syntax errors?
No, I was gonna say, hey, I see what you did that last piece.
That's pretty good.
That's why I like Splunk text. And check this out.
Oh, you can do it within multiple.
Yeah, my tabs aren't aligned very good. That's the problem. I can say account.
The paste,
Yeah.
copy pasting different things that you're saying.
On the multiple lines.
You can even like copy from Excel.
Can you?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you do multiple like files? Can you spend files?
I don't think so. No.
So I just didn't know. I didn't know like you could open this and that and that.
Can you also the meaning of life?
Okay. I probably should have just had implemented one of those. It would have been a little bit quicker, but.
And make the conversion between the object that you receive into the
Yes, the generic type into the concrete type. Yep, so it makes it easy. You don't have to worry about casting.
right.
Okay. All right, so we're going to work with, if you're not all the way along, if you can just do, for example, do I want to show? Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what example I might want to show. What would be an example of when I do something with a related record?
Like you want to update the related record.
Some related record.
So you could push down to like address changes. I don't know how far down contact information.
Okay, address change would be interesting because there's some complexities there.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you would essentially push that either down or push it out.
Okay. All right, so the main method that the main thing I need everyone to have implemented is just the before handle before update. So if you haven't finished the other ones, then you can comment them out. So make sure that you have handle before update, and then in your trigger helper, we just need to make sure that however you're configured, you're going to call the handle before update. Okay. No, actually, I'm sorry. Let's do the after update.
But usually you just do like new opportunities or like
Is there an address opportunity? I'll just do content.
yeah, just but usually you also want to like existing opportunities.
Well, I'm showing.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to worry about it now, but like that's what the usual is.
Is it wrong? All right, if you guys copied this, it's wrong. This should be old math.
The websites.
All right, so the main trigger that we need is this after update. We just want to make sure that's implemented. So if you're not quite here, you can just comment out the rest of your code for a moment. We just want to make sure that you have this this part. I'll actually comment out these ones here. So in your trigger helper, let's just have this one active, okay? So that if you're not caught up, we can just get you to this one place. So I commented out the rest of my code. Make sure that you call your account trigger helper dot handle after update. We're going to pass in trigger.new and trigger.old map. Okay. Make sure that you save your helper class first and then save your trigger. Make sure you can successfully save both files without compilation errors. Okay. So this is a common pattern. I like this trigger pattern. There are some other trigger patterns where there's this big factory that kind of handles everything for you. If you look through the Maven's Mate templates there's like a trigger handler template, and there's a URL. So if you apply that, there's a URL that you can go to, and they'll give you some best practices for some more kind of enterprise grade strategies for this. Okay. All right. Is there anyone that's not quite there yet? You said 1 second?
Yeah.
We're good? Okay.
Can we see
It'd be nice if we had like a chat and could just paste the stuff in.
I think we can set that up. Like if we were to do something like this. Yeah. It's good now.
Some Slack room, maybe?
Yeah, that would sound good. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. All right. So let's go through a scenario. Let's say that on our account, anytime that the user updates the billing address, what we want to do is we want to push that update down to our contacts. Okay, so on our contacts, let me find an account that has a contact. Gene finally used that one. Okay, so what we want to do is that if the user comes in, makes a change to any of these fields here, we want to update all the contact records, and we want to update the mailing address on the contact records, okay? So anytime the billing address is changed, any field on the billing address, we want to go make an update on all the contact records, okay? So this is a pretty complex example. It seems really easy, but then when you think about what's happening, our trigger is called from potentially 200 different accounts at once. They all have their own contacts, and we need to find out, we need to check what's called a compound field. The address fields, I don't know why the back arrow is not working. The address field, while it's shown as one field here, is actually these 5 fields. So we're going to have to check these 5 fields to see if any of them have changed. Then if that's the case, then we're going to want to query all of our contact records to make those changes. Okay? It's a little bit tricky example, but I think it's going to show us how to deal with some like medium complexity use cases. Okay. If we were only working with one account at a time, it's really easy. But we have to bulkify everything. So let's just start and let's work through with some pseudocode and talk about the things we need to go through to solve this problem. So what I like to do is I like to create helper methods so that in my trigger, I can just call maybe 3 helper methods that do different business functions. So you can rearrange those to set the order. And you can also comment one out really, really easily if you decide you're trying to troubleshoot or you want to turn something off. Okay, so let's make a static method. And we're going to call this one, we're going to say check for billing address change. All right. And let's just pass in, it's going to have the same signature as our handle after update method. Okay. All right, and so let's, I'm gonna go back to one window here. All right, so let's just in our minds think about the scenario where someone data loads 2 accounts. One of those accounts has some contacts, the other one doesn't have some contacts. So if we think about, like, oh, the data coming in could be these various scenarios, how might we handle that? Okay. All right, so what are the steps that we're going to need to go through? Can we try to figure those out as a group? Okay, we're going to loop accounts. So I'm just going to write some pseudocode here so that we can then dive in. So first we think we're going to probably have to loop the accounts, right? Then what are we going to have to do?
Check for
Okay.
get the billing address of everyone.
Yep. So so we need to find out if the billing address has changed. What steps do we need to take to figure out if the billing address has changed?
Between the accounts, the new one, and the old account.
Okay. Yep. So we're just going to check to see if a field changed. Okay. And I think we could maybe write a generic method so that we can make that a little bit easier because we're going to have a whole bunch of fields we have to check. So we'll go through that just because you guys are all developers, so we can do some kind of advanced stuff. Okay. And then if changed, then what?
Get the list of contacts related to that account.
Okay, so we're going to have to get the list of contacts for changed account. Okay, remember, our trigger is called with up to 200 accounts. Okay, how many SQL queries can we do? Maximum of 100. And when we operate, and we're going to have to do more DML statements, which are going to cause more triggers to fire, which might have some more queries. So we want to be as efficient as possible. We only want to make one query to get all the contacts. Okay? So we're going to need to aggregate a list of all our account IDs that meet this condition, then query the accounts or the contacts, and then for each contact, we're going to then have to go look and find the address information for that parent account and then set the field. So it's a little bit tricky. All right? Okay, so we're going to get a list of contacts. Then we're going to query the contacts. Then we're going to update fields. And then we're going to perform DML. Okay, so that's the list of our steps. So when I'm training brand new people how to write Apex, it's really hard to explain this, like, the complex things that you have to go through, even just a way to think about solving these problems when you're working with all this data. So you guys have an advantage because you're already engineers, so it's all good. All right, so let's just go through our loop here.
But that isn't bad actually, because most of what you're describing here that we need to take care about before doing the stuff like, okay, let's aggregate and then do one query. Actually, that the platform enforces that is really good, because we have seen with coders in Java that because it's easy to just fire the query not to care about, and then you need to optimize that code because that's bad in any kind of application. So that is actually a good practice in general that most of us should be used to. So it's actually a good thing. And I was talking with Gerardo or something like that, because they were running into issues and they had to optimize to get down from 20 minutes of response time to 5 minutes. So when I was saying, okay, here you're going to have 5 minutes and get it done there, or you're done. So it's actually a good thing.
It's good. Sometimes it's frustrating.
Yeah, but it makes you think harder before doing the stuff, because otherwise it's just not going to work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So how are we gonna find the old version of the account?
For using the ID.
Yep.
Account ID.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll create a new variable called old account, and we're going to call old account map.get, and we're going to pass in the account ID so that we're retrieving the old version of the account. Okay. From here, so now what we need to do is we need to compare 4 different fields. So just for fun, let's go ahead and create a helper method to help us do this a little bit easier. And I'm just doing this on the fly, so hopefully there's no mistakes or no complexities here. So let's say public static, let's say that returns a Boolean, and we'll say compare field. Okay, we'll say that it takes a string. That's the field name. Okay. Okay, so we'll say object 1. Let's call this one new object.
You define a compare method by each type. For example, compare string, compare text, integer, compare booleans, and then using this method, another method that, sorry, my question is, can I have the type of the ECO is as option in any way, for any way?
So there's a way that you can call the describe, like the methods that you would get on the metadata API. You can make a describe call to get the data type of any field. These are expensive operations, but it is possible that you can get the definitions for any fields, figure out what the data types are, to then take some action. Okay. So in this case, we're looking at something new. So we created a helper method. Yes, you guys are sharp. All right. So what we're going to do is, because normally we use dot notation to access a field property, but because we want that to be dynamic, if we use the generic type of SObject, then because Salesforce doesn't know what type it is, they have a get method and a set method that we can interact with any of the fields that can work on any SObjects. So what we can do here, we're not going to worry too much about error checking, but if that field didn't exist on that object, it would throw an exception. But if we know these fields exist, so we're going to go, we're not going to worry about that for this use case. Actually, let's create variables here just so we can make it a little bit easier, or a little bit more verbose. All right. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to get our field name. Okay. All right, so this returns the object. It doesn't know what data type. It doesn't know what data type exists when we get the field. So you have to cast it to the data type. Or in our case, we don't really care what the data type is. We just care if this value is equal to this value. Okay. And actually, we don't even need if. We can probably just do return. We'll probably just do that. I hope this works.
Every time you override the equals method, for example, first check that you need to do is the two objects are objects of the same class. So, but in this case,
yes. Well, Salesforce does some interesting checking with equals equals. They also have equals equals equals. Yeah, so you can't really I don't think you can override equals class. Yeah, they handle some of that behind the scenes automatically for us. Okay. All right. So what fields are we going to want to compare?
Billing address.
Okay, so the billing address field is available, but it's a complex field,
Yeah.
which means we don't want to work with it in Apex.
Yeah.
Okay.
Folder.
We, okay. If we come look at our account fields, notice here that it just says all it shows us is billing address, but really the fields that we actually have are these fields here. Okay, so this is one that can be a little bit tricky. I recommend using some other tool because the UI just said billing address is one field, but really Salesforce breaks that up into billing address, billing city, billing country, billing state, okay, and street. Oh, so no, billing address is no one we don't want to use. Okay, so let's make this easy. Let's maybe not check every single one. Let's just say that if the billing street, I'm gonna put these here in comments here. So billing street, we'll say billing state, or okay. Let's just check one of these three fields. We won't worry about the zip code or anything. Well, that one's probably really important. We'll just do these ones for the example. All right. Okay. All right. So we're going to call this method. Okay, so we're going to pass in the account. Okay. So we're not really gaining any efficiencies here. I just created this method down here to show you guys an example of working with generics because I have this utility class that I usually implement on every single project that I'm on, where you can pass in like a list of accounts and old accounts, and you can pass in a list of fields, and it will tell you if any of those fields have changed. You know, so I usually have some helper methods that just work at the list level to make it really, really easy. So we could just have a one-liner and pass in a list of fields, and it would handle this for us. Okay, so let's just go ahead and copy these down. Okay, let's just put these all in one if statement, I guess. Oh wait, hang on. We actually probably want this to be not equals, right? We can choose however we want to do it. We just need to make sure our logic matches. Okay, I'll just do not equals. So I changed this to not equals down here. So what will happen is if the fields don't match, then it will return true. Okay. My name should be more descriptive, but
I think the OR is missing. Your
yes.
operator.
I was wondering why it was looking weird. My brain was trying to process it. Okay. All right. So what we're saying is that if the street, the state, or the city on this account was modified, now we want to take some action. So what action might we want to take?
Get the list of the contacts. No, add to a list.
Okay. Generally, what we would do is we would create a set of ID.
Okay, yes.
And we do that just to guarantee, because we're going to need to do a query. And if you can query, you can say where, you know, account ID in, and then provide a list. But if there are duplicate values in that list, it'll throw an exception. So we would want to use a set. Okay. In this case, I don't think we would have any accounts duplicated. Yes.
Question. We look upon accounts.
Mm-hmm.
and the first sentence, we get the account on the old account map. Yes, that is because this is called after update. So the account that we are getting exists in the old account. That it exists because why? Because I don't understand the old account map. What does it contain?
So the old account map contains the values before our database transaction happened. Okay, so when we say update account, Salesforce queries or it gets the data of those records, saves them, and then our new data is modified, and it still has the old data in memory. And so then it provides both of those to us in the trigger. Okay, and then it's when we used trigger.oldMap, it put that list into a map where the key is the record ID, so that we can easily retrieve the record that we want, so we can compare the new version versus the old version that was in the database before this transaction started.
In this case, because we are calling on an update.
So yes, update will always have old and new account, old and new, and then old and new map. Yes. On insert, after insert, we'll always have the old map, but before.
The old account map has all the accounts that currently are in the memory.
Yes, the old account map.
Why
is the same?
Why I don't have the new and the old? And why the other are in a map do you understand what I'm?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
So the reason they're in a map is because we use the old map. If we used old, then they would not have been in a map. They would have been in a list. So Salesforce gives us a list version and a map version.
Okay, now I understand. Yeah, because they could be both. Yeah.
Okay.
Could be both operations. Okay.
So one other thing I want to show you really quickly. There's a constructor on the map object that allows you to pass in a list of records, and it will convert that into a map with the ID as the key.
Nice.
So this is a helper method that's available anytime. If you want to just turn this into a map where the ID is the key, you can just pass that into the constructor once you're creating a new map instance. Okay. You can also put a query right inside those. You'll see that sometimes in code where there will be a query there. So it's nothing special. We're just passing it to the constructor. Okay. Is there a question in the back?
I think about what's happening with the old account doesn't exist, but the trigger is true when the action is update. This situation doesn't have never.
Yep. So we have it.
Sorry. You change one account, but the trigger is thrown for all accounts.
No. So no. So we have a guarantee that. So only one record will be provided if one record was updated, and we have a guarantee that trigger.new and trigger.old will have the exact same records, and they will be in the exact same order. Okay, so there would never be a case when there would be a problem with your data.
Porque el trigger se puede disparar con muchos registros.
Pero en este caso lo disparamos.
En este caso sí.
Okay. All right, so now what we've done is we've just kept track of all of our account IDs. So then we're done with our for loop. And if you guys see issues in my logic, please let me know. I hope it works. All right. So after this, we probably want to check to make sure that this is greater than 0. Because if we can avoid doing a database query, we should avoid doing a database query, especially in a trigger, right? We have limits, so you need to really make sure that you're not doing queries unless you really need to, okay? So if account IDs is greater than 0, now what do we want to do?
They or no, retrieve all the contacts.
Yep, so what we're going to do is we're going to get a list of contacts. Okay, and in this case, we don't really care about getting all the fields, so because we're going to update all the fields, we don't need to access those values, so we'll do it easy this time. Okay. Okay. So there's one complexity here that we haven't really accounted for. So as I'm looping these contacts, how do I know what to set the address to?
Now you have to look through the set, I think.
Okay. So what we should probably do is we should probably create a map with for our account so that we can grab our accounts to get the address. Okay. But we don't. I guess it could contain everything. Okay. So let's go ahead and create a map of account. We're going to call this one new account map. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and use that constructor. We'll go ahead and pass in accounts here. What we could have done is we could have used trigger.newMap, but because our initial method didn't take that in, we'll just go ahead and do a quick conversion here. So it's probably a small performance hit, but I would say it's probably negligible. Because at most we have 200 records.
Okay.
Okay. So all we've done here is we've just created an extra map where the account ID is the key, and then the account is the value. But on our query, we need to include the account ID so that as we're looping through, we have the value to go look up our account. And then we can get the addresses from our account, and we can set those on the contact. Okay? Any questions with that? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and let's go loop through these. Okay, so we're going to loop through our contact.
So you define a word clause.
Yeah, you have to define the word clause.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to say we're account ID in colon account IDs. Okay. This is a really common pattern. If by chance we haven't talked about dynamic queries, there's a database class where you can say database.query and you can pass in a string. Okay, so if you need to build a dynamic query, and the in clause expects that you have parentheses around the outsides and then a comma separated list of strings. You have to escape those because it requires that they have single quotes around those strings. So you have to escape those.
The in-clause has a limit, a max limit.
I'm not
sure. For example, in Oracle, the in-clause has a limit.
Okay, well, it might follow Oracle because they're using Oracle as the database. In this case, it would be less than 200. 200 would be the very maximum. So we should be okay. But yeah, those are good things to think about. And so that's, volume testing your code to make sure it works, especially in Salesforce, because there's just a lot of things that you're not really sure about with limitations. So after we loop through the contact, let's go ahead and just create a variable for the account. Let's grab the variable, grab the account from our new account map. Okay, and in this case, we're going to say contact.accountID. Okay, notice here, account ID. You just have to memorize this pattern. Because contact is a standard object, and because the relationship to the account is a standard relationship, it's not custom, the format is always going to be, in this case, it's the API name of the parent object and then the word ID. Okay, so if you're on order and order product, the API name for order product is called order item. So if you're on the order item, then order ID would be the ID field of the parent. Okay. All right, so we get the account, and then let's go ahead and set all of our fields. We probably need to set everything. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set our contact, whatever the name is. Okay, we're going to have to go look up, I think it's mailing. I'm pretty sure it's mailings street.
I can search it.
You what?
I can search for it if you want.
Okay. I'm looking it up. So address, city. We also want country. We do state.
They are the same.
It says billing.
Yes, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's mailing.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so the fields that we're going to update, I'll go ahead and type this in quickly. We kind of chose a hard field, by the way. This is a complex field, but it's good. It shows you sometimes it can be pretty tricky to figure out. So, we can blame Justin. Okay. I'm sure we have errors in our code. Okay. One thing we might want to do is we might want to add a few debug statements, just so that when we open it up in our log, we can just have some visual idea of what's going on in our code. Go ahead and add some debug statements. So I'm going to add some stuff down here in our compare field. And then also, as we're adding an account,
So maybe you talked about it before, but what is the difference between S object and object type?
So, well, object type, everything inherits from object type, just like in Java. S object is the parent object for all of the S objects, like account, contact. They all inherit from S object. Okay. So if you go look at the S object class in the Salesforce documentation, you can see what type of methods exist. Okay, so it's just the generic way where if you need to work with any type, then you can use this as the generic type for any of those. All right, and then the last thing that we have to do is we have to perform or update on our contacts, right? So I'm going to do another check to make sure that, you know, if there were no results returned, let's just go ahead and skip the update. Even though if you update an empty list, I don't think it doesn't do anything. So we would have been okay. All right, I'm going to try to save. Hopefully that works.
Nice
work.
Yeah, I got lucky.
You have a compiler in your name.
No,
It's like IntelliJ. You have a thread, a background thread.
All right. Are there any questions? You guys think this is like really hard or complicated or?
Not so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. You have to kind of learn it, but the concepts hopefully are familiar with other problems you try to solve.
What will be the approach if you have, for instance, instead of updating the contact, retrieve or navigate to another object, a second object to update, retrieve those records in a separate query? Or?
So it depends. So if you can figure out a good base object where you can do some relationship queries, especially a subquery, then you can maybe try to combine getting multiple objects in one query. Because usually the other object is probably also related to the account in some way. So if you can maybe do a query that has multiple subqueries, then you can work on all the return data at once. But if it's completely unrelated, then maybe you wanted to get all the contracts or something like that. Like maybe there's not really a good relationship for whatever reason. Then you would need to do an additional query. So yeah, some of those, some design decisions that you make early on can like really impact the code structure. And sometimes you have to do some pretty major refactors once a new business requirement comes in that totally changes everything. But you guys probably all deal with that no matter what. Okay, you guys ready to see if our code works? Yeah. Okay. Is there anyone that's not quite ready?
Yeah, we're
All right, is there anyone that's not ready? Does anyone need help? All right, I'll give you guys just a couple more minutes. You can go try it on your own and see if it blows up. Take the fall from me.
Cambio de cartas a contactos. De Lawrence a...
Okay. The problem. Let's see.
Yes.
Yeah, look down here because it's highlighting.
Yeah, trigger. I do the exact one.
Salesforce made some changes on the way that you should be able to use this. You saw return one error, but now and then you're reaching out to contact and contact. And I think that's symptoms.
No, it could be that you want to do a check for everyone. So all the checks in one. So check this one, check that field, check that field, and only change.
Yeah.
Instead of change everything.
Yeah.
They just updated the zip, but the address was correct. You don't want to update everything again.
Yeah.
No, pero
Yeah, that's one way.
This is how I do my coding.
Yeah. Those surprisingly like cost us money.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they are.
And that's why if you're looking at a way to eliminate process flow, you should probably go ahead and look at it. You can make performance because what that's going to do is
I'm using Exchange. Do you know the account to do my check? The comparison between fields, here we're like, we're storing the account, all this data, and then storing all this data, and check between the two.
No.
Here, we're just using the function is change in the process.
I'm gonna add the postal code. That's a really common one that you might change. So I added this line 42.
Yeah, but I believe that's what is changed.
Did anyone check it? Did it work? Did you get error?
So Seth and I built out this huge process, number of process builders for Cardinal.
Are you, did you log anything out?
We got it to work, it was all working just fine. And then last, it was the last day of our project, we got it working. But then they didn't do testing on it, and as soon as we got the final lines, it broke.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so they had to, so they were freaking out at first, but well, you know, all the logic's in the process builder. So we just recommended that they just have to develop the right trigger and just pull the logic out.
Yeah.
So it was all there.
Yeah.
The design was
Everything is like, what do I need to check? Okay, I know the exact fields and what I need to change based on that.
Yeah. But like we were terrified. Like I was like, my last plan, I wasn't getting back. And they're like saying this is broken.
Do you have line down or something there?
No, so I'm not sure if I was
Oh, that's
so that's why we don't have that. No, I usually do Minneapolis or Denver.
Yeah.
Sometimes Salt Lake, but rarely.
Did it work?
Did you miss something?
Yeah. To call that method.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's, as soon as you said that, your other screen out.
It's just like I'm setting it, not setting it to active initially and then going back.
Yeah.
All right. Make sure that you called your method. Okay. And you'll probably notice something really interesting once this goes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and try it. Worked? It worked. Account, billing address.
Yes.
You could also say that this is something that could have been done in process builder.
Visual.
But this is more, probably more efficient kind of borderline.
I know it's amazing.
My street. Oh man, I didn't have my logs. Okay. All right, so looks like this worked, which is thankful. Okay, so I'm going to change this, and if everyone can look up here, I'm going to go through my logs so that we can go look at this together, because we might notice some interesting things that maybe you weren't expecting. Okay, so we updated the account, and I'm just going to go glance at my two contacts, make sure they were both updated to 123 Sesame Street. Okay, yes, that one looks updated. This one looks updated. Great. So now when I open my log, thank you. Okay. Number 4. By the way, this filter is case sensitive. It's kind of annoying. Okay, great. Never mind. What I thought was interesting actually wasn't the case. So one thing I want to point out is if you're working with master detail relationships and you update a child record, if you have summary roll-up fields, then what will happen is that will make the parent records fire because they're being modified because the child records were updated. Okay? So that's sometimes that can lead to confusion. So think about if that would have happened here, we update our account, then we update our contacts. If those made our account trigger fire, then all our trigger will run again. Except when it runs the second time, when we check to see if the address changed, none of them would show as changed because now it's, you know, it's called from a separate, Yeah, it's called again. So all of our logic wouldn't get called again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool. All right, I need a break after that. Yeah, but it's pretty late, so let's just do a quick 5-minute break.
Okay.
So I'm having Buster Down tomorrow. I'm staying because he's in the apartment downtown. I'm sure close to where you're at. But you only Fingers crossed.
Don't work, don't work, don't work. Maybe you already tested it.
I haven't done this the first time.
Oh,
This one is really nice.
It didn't work. No, it didn't work. I was looking at the wrong thing. Yeah.
Oh man, yours has a map.
I actually did think 1, 2, 3 street was gonna come out. I don't know. There's actually a place, a street, this is called Street. It's Cortesville Road.
Weird.
Yeah. So that might be not those in my contact too. You think if
All right. All right, so Zeke was able to accomplish the same task using point and click configurations. So there's a couple of things in Salesforce that we haven't really talked about that, you know, as you learn more about the platform, you have to learn about lots of concepts. But two of those concepts, one is workflow rules and one is process builder. Okay? So there's a lot you can do with the platform without writing code. And I'll go ahead and just showcase a couple of these items here. So the first one is I'm going to show is workflow rules. What this does, let me skip past that, is it allows you, it's just like a trigger. So anytime a database transaction happens, you can have a workflow rule do some simple automation. Okay, so if I go ahead and create a new one, I'll just create one just to show you what it looks like. So let's say that I go to the lead object. If you guys remember, the lead is a salesperson when there's a potential sale, right? And that can turn into an account, a contact, and an opportunity. So lead, okay. So, okay, so what we do is we name the rule. We can say, when do we want the rule to fire? Do we want it to fire every time a record is created, every time it's created, and every time it's edited? Or every time it's created and edited, but only if it meets the following criteria that we define down here. So we could say where lead, email, not equal to, and then we leave it blank, it's null. So we could say anytime that the email address is not null, okay, so anytime that's true, this would fire. So that would be one option. I'm going to go ahead and say fire this rule all the time whenever it's created. Let me get rid of this stuff here. All right, formula evaluates the true. I'm going to just do a cheat here real quick. Why can't I type? Okay. So what we're doing here is you just define some entry criteria. So imagine you had a trigger and you just have some if statements where you're looking at the data and figuring out, do you want to take some action or not? That's essentially what we're doing. Okay, but then these are the things that you're allowed to do from, so that's the workflow rule. And then we can add one or more actions. We can also add one or more time-dependent actions. So we can say, in the future, make this action fire. So you could say, in 30 days, send an email alert to somebody, or create a new task. A task is some action that some user needs to take. Or you can update some other field on the record. Okay, so you can say that anytime a new lead is created with an email, you can send a new email to a salesperson or a manager and say, new lead created here, you know, give them their email address or something like that. Okay, one other thing we can do is we can send an outbound message. Okay, so what this allows us to do is this allows us to send a SOAP request to an external web service. So when we do this, we choose what fields we want, and then it'll let us download a WSDL for that. And then you can configure an endpoint so that you can say anytime a record changes, send off this payload to this external system without writing any code in Salesforce. So that can be really handy for some basic integrations. If all you're doing is just wanting to know when records changed, and then the integration could call back and maybe query more data and do some other things. So that's really handy. Okay, so that's a workflow rule. The other feature, and this is what Zeke used. Okay, one quick thing. Workflow rules. If you're doing a field update, which is a really common thing to do, remember when we were saying the contracted checkbox or the ordered checkbox on the opportunity? Zeke said, generally we automate checking these types of things. We usually do that using workflow rules. So we might say, when the opportunity stage is equal to closed won, set the contracted checkbox to true. So that way, the salesperson doesn't ever have to do that, but we've automated that using point-and-click configurations to make that automation happen. Okay? And then you might add triggers on top of that, where when the contract's created, maybe you add some additional custom logic. So a lot of times you pair these things together. But a workflow rule, a field update, can only update the record that made it fire. So this other feature called Process Builder, which you should avoid like the plague. So let's, I'll just show a quick example here. So Process Builder is like a declarative workflow tool. Okay. So you specify some things. You can say, hey, whenever a record changes, you want to take some action. So this allows a little bit more complex configuration. So you can add an object like a count, then you can add some criteria. And so what Zeke did is he checked all the fields that make up the address, all the billing address fields, and you can check to say is changed. Okay? And then if that's the case, then your actions, you can say update related records. So then he updated.
Very easy.
I built it in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay. That's amazing.
All right. Actually, here, let's just say account.
But there are some really big limits to
Yes,
process
of course,
building.
yeah, I hate those kinds of.
Okay. So I might actually.
You could probably build it here pretty quick.
Let's just. So I'm going to go ahead and comment out my trigger and have this run so that we can look in the logs and see what happens, because I want to show you some of the pitfalls of this. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to make this really simple. I'm just going to check if the billing street, that's the one I wanted, if the billing street is changed. Okay, so we're saying as long as the billing street is changed, am I doing this right, Zeke? Okay. Then I want to update records. Okay. Contacts. Okay, so that showed the child relationship names there. And then we'll go ahead and we're going to set the mailing street. And we're going to set this equal to our account, our billing street. Okay. I'm just doing a really quick example so that we can see how this works. So our trigger is active. I'm going to comment out just the line where we call our method. So our trigger.new and trigger.old, those will still fire. Okay, is that all I should have to do and activate?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to come back here and I am going to just comment out this one line of code. Make sure that it compiles and saves. Okay, we're subscribed to logs. All right, so now if I come to one of our accounts, I guess that would work. I didn't actually propagate all those.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just change this to the word changed. I'm just curious how many times the trigger will fire. Okay. All right, so I click change, our record saved. Let's see if it worked. And of course it didn't work. Come on, Zeke. You said it would work. Okay, darn it.
What are your process builder? Start the account.
Count.
Oh, a record is created. You broke it. You got a new process.
I can just do a version count.
And you can't change that setting. Just call it process number 2. I don't know if this will allow you to choose that setting.
Okay. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and deactivate this. So the main point I wanted to show is that this process builder, this was written by some company. Salesforce acquired that company and brought it into their own product. So this is just a custom UI. All this stuff just gets turned to Apex behind the scenes. So it's a really cool concept. But if you think about how generic your code has to be to handle some pretty complex interactions, you're going to have a lot of queries. You're going to have a lot of database transactions. It's not very efficient. And the CPU time to process all this data is really heavy. So we find sometimes where a client will have 100 process builders and a lot of automation, and they're running into limits and having problems. So we've, in some cases, like for Kronos, for example, we had to come turn like 25 of their process builders back into code just because they were so inefficient and they were hitting a lot of limits. So there's kind of a balance. I try to steer clear of these, but there are some use cases where it's so much easier to do this that it makes sense to do a process builder. As developers, you probably won't be creating any of these. You might on a very rare occasion, because sometimes it might be easier to have this do some of the basic stuff. One other thing that we could do is one of our actions, you can actually write Apex and you can add an annotation, like a decorator that says like, I forget exactly what it is, but you can say that, specify that it's invocable, and you can call code from this process builder. So instead of writing a trigger for it to start, you can start using point and click, and then you can call some code, and that code can also be used in other areas of your application. So knowing that these tools exist is just part of like understanding the whole platform and being effective. You're probably seeing a recurring theme here about dependencies of the platform and all these things. So if you don't learn the platform, you're going to want to write code for everything when that might not be the best option. Did you have a question?
Yeah, well, I think you answered it. So all the different limits that you mentioned before, like CPU and other things, are also applied to this and the workflow rules.
Yes, right? I heard a rumor. I haven't validated if it's true or not. But the SOCL queries, every time there's a blue diamond, it means you're getting a SOCL query. But someone was telling me that.
For you, so if you want to fire it again, it should work.
Okay. Yeah, someone was saying that the SOCL queries should no longer be counted against your limit, but CPU time will still count. So they're trying to make improvements to this and make it. They really like people to use declarative parts of their platform because it's it just enables so much. Okay, so Zeke said that he changed it. Okay. Change again, it worked. All right, so now if we go to our log, let's just take a look and see if it looks any different from when we wrote our code. It might, I'm not 100% sure. Okay. Looks like it still only ran twice. Okay, I want to show you one other thing here. So if you guys will look on my screen, sometimes you're going to be troubleshooting and you won't really know what workflow rules are firing, what other automation that's not code, or maybe even if it is code, you might want to try to see what's firing. Once you open up a log, you can go to debug, and you can change your perspective to analysis. And what this will do, this will read your log, and this will give you some analytics here. There's a bug. How this works, I forgot. Okay, so this shows here that our account trigger was called twice, and then we had a workflow that was called. This was the workflow rule that I created that didn't actually have an action, or no, it shouldn't have been activated. That was probably the process builder.
And why it's fired twice? Because we have two contacts, right?
Before and after. Yep. Okay, and then it also shows our timeline here, so we can see exactly how long are things fired. So we don't have very much going on right now, but if you're troubleshooting and you're hitting limits, this is a good place to check. You can also come over to executed units, and you can count. Okay, so this will show you. So this will show queries here, and so this will show things like how many times a trigger was called, how many times a SOCL query was called. If there's a workflow rule that ran, you can, in the log, you can actually see what the values were that it was operating on and what it evaluated to. So you'll have to spend some time to come learn about the developer console, especially this is, just a reminder, this is called the perspective. Okay. Yeah, it's pretty neat. It's pretty fun to look around, especially when you start getting into like environments that have a lot of code that's running. You can see a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, all right, it's 4:08, so we are really short on time. I want to review just a few things here. So what I wanted to cover, one is inner classes. We'll cover that because it's really short. Asynchronous apex. I'm going to give you guys an overview of how this works, but we're not going to do any coding examples. Unit tests, we should probably do some light code examples on this just because it's important and required. And then visual force, I'll just give you an overview on this. There's a lot of great trailheads out there I would recommend you to go learn about because it's really common that we would, there's some small custom visual force, UIs that need to be created. And then in addition to that, developing on the Lightning platform is a completely different experience as well. So if we have time, I'll touch on those things. And then, yeah, so we might need to have some follow-up, like 1 or 2 hour sessions remotely, over time. I'm happy to continue having some recurring meeting with you guys. That would probably be good so you can get some questions answered, just get some extra help. So I'd be more than happy to do that. And then, of course, there's HTTP as well. Okay, so let's jump through these. So inner classes. Okay, I'm just going to pull up an example from another org. Okay. Let me see if I can remember. I don't think I'm going to remember where it was. Okay, great. Here's an example. All right, so this use case, we haven't dealt with Salesforce billing, but if you think about billing, we have invoices, and with invoices, we have payments. So we had a company that whenever an invoice was created, they wanted to create a payment record. They wanted to allocate that payment to pay off all the invoice lines. And then they wanted us to create these staging records that would then be pushed to their external system, and their external system would debit the bank account. So they already had this payment system. So they just wanted us to manipulate Salesforce to interact with their other system that was doing all the interaction with the bank. And so we have this helper class. So notice here, Salesforce allows us to have an inner class. Okay, so in Java, you're probably really familiar with creating a POJO, right? Plain old Java object just to represent a data structure. In Apex, we don't find that we do that very often. We do that a lot if we're interacting with an API where we need to like serialize or deserialize JSON, which JSON, that deserialization and serialization is just built into the platform as well. So you can go research that. But usually what we see is that in a lot of cases, we can create a class inside of another class. In this case, I just needed a data structure so that I could keep this information together. Because this was running from a trigger on invoice or invoice line, I had a whole bunch of stuff, but I needed to figure out, like I needed to keep relationships of data together so that I didn't have to have maps everywhere to try to figure it out, because that's just hard. So in this case, I created an inner class, and then I added a little bit of business logic here where once that data was passed in, I passed in the account and the invoice, and it would go through and figure out a little bit of information so that I could make decisions later on. Okay? So this is a common theme where if you need a more complex data structure, you can just create an inner class, wherever your logic is, like right in your helper method or business logic class, whatever it is. And that'll help you just interact with your data a little bit easier. Also, when you're working in Visualforce, there might be times when you want to represent a table of data, or you want to show data in a certain way. And the way that you want to show data might not match the same structure that you have in your S objects. So you can create an inner class that represents the data structure in the way that the UI wants it to be represented, so that it's a lot easier to work with inside of your HTML pages. Okay. Yeah, it sounds like they use C# for some of their features. Yeah. So. Okay. Yep. So it's nothing advanced or fancy here. Just know that this feature is available. There are some limitations. I think all the properties might have to be public or something like that. So there's lots of documentation on everything on Salesforce. So Salesforce puts out 3 releases a year. Every single release, they have at minimum 500-page release documents. And those are available in preview even before the release comes out. So that just shows you that they're very invested in their documentation. Doesn't mean it's always the best, but there's always a lot of it. Okay. Great. So I'm going to go through some of the asynchronous features. Again, there's a lot of trailheads on how to use some of these features here. The first 2 we have is future and queuable. All right. So one limitation of triggers don't allow making an HTTP call out to another system. Okay? And because of that, we need something to happen asynchronously so that it can happen, but our trigger can just finish and the user can go on. So that's a common use case. So queuable and future are essentially the exact same thing. Let me see if I can find an example here. Okay. Oh man, it's that one was commented out. Okay, here we go. By the way, this isn't code that I wrote. This was the client's developer in this case.
And that use a kind of promise?
No.
Oh.
No promise. No. We're not that lucky. All right. So the way that this works is for future, you create a method and you just add future annotation. If you're making a call out, then you have to specify that you're making a call out. If not, you can just do this. Okay? Otherwise, you can say call out equals true. All right. And then any method that has @future has some limitations. Every single parameter that's passed into the method has to be a primitive type or a list of primitive types. You can't pass in a list of S objects, for example. you can only pass in like a set of IDs for those objects. And then in your future method, you have to requery the database. Okay? So what Salesforce says is that, you know, because there's no guarantee on when this is going to run. I mean, it's near real time, but, you know, it's based on resources. So the database could have changed by the time that you called this and the time that this actually ran. So because of that, you know, to avoid issues with data, they require that you requery all the data. And that's why you can only pass in primitive types here. Okay? And aside from that, this operates just like any regular Apex. So you didn't really have to do anything, and you get this, you know, additional thread. If you're in a future context, you're not allowed to invoke an additional future context. You can't chain these things together. And then as we saw on the limits page, we have increased limits if you're in an asynchronous context. So you can make 200 queries instead of 100. And as soon as this runs, it runs in a brand new context. So all your limits are reset as soon as this calls out. You know, so if you have really long-running operations, then you might want to use future. Okay. The other function that you can use is queuable. Queuable is the same concept, except it uses an interface instead of annotation. Okay. So the way that works. Public class. All right. I don't remember exactly what the name is, so you would say like implements the, you know, it'd be something like this. Okay. I don't know exactly. I don't remember exactly, but public static void. And then there's the method signature. The only method you have to implement is execute. Okay, and so then on the system class, there's like system.enqueueJob, or there's some method that you call, and you pass in a new instance of this queuable, and then it will call the execute method. Okay, so you can have a constructor here. This one allows you to pass in any data type and store your data here. So you can store a lot more complex types. You can give this a lot more context. So benefit number one is you can use this with any data type as your data that you're starting with. Benefit number two is that when this is done, you can call another queuable, so you can chain them together. Okay, and there might be, I don't know if there's a specific way to do that. Like I don't really know. I think it knows when this one finishes, and then it will go to the next one. It won't run them in parallel. Limitations of this is you can only have one queuable job running at a time. So the reason why that's important is because Stillbrick uses queuable jobs. Okay? So I'll show you an example of how we can prove that. So in the Salesforce UI, Salesforce provides ways for you to check out what's going on. So I think it's probably Apex jobs, background jobs. Okay. So we can see here that a bunch of stuff happened from our user yesterday, right? We haven't really done much today as far as like quotes go, but we can see that we have a bunch of stuff here that's been firing. So with the contracting process, when you click the contracted checkbox and hit save, what that does, there's a trigger that kicks off a queuable, and the contract is created asynchronously. So if you click through really fast or there's a high load on the system, the contract might not show up right away, right? So that just depends on resources. So the problem is, if you're trying to make a queuable run at the same time that Stillbrick kicks off a queuable, then you're going to get an exception because it'll say too many queuables added to the queue. Okay? And then also Stillbrick billing, I think when you order, I'm pretty sure that CPQ somehow chains a billing namespace queuable job after that. So the order creation process, a lot of times you want automation, and that's a really hard place to add automation. There's just a lot going on. So we can talk about those complexities later, probably when you run into them, and you know, I can provide you some advice, or I can help you work through some of those issues. Okay, so that's queuable and future. So those are things that say, do this in near real time. Do this, you know, immediately. But you know, we say immediately, it could be any time in the next. I don't know. There's no guarantees on the exact time, but it's soon. The other two asynchronous processes that we have are batchable and schedulable. Okay, a lot of times you combine these together. So schedulable just means that you can have an Apex class that implements database.schedulable or something like that. And then you can either schedule that through code, or in the UI, you can go to Apex classes and choose schedule Apex. And from here, you can come choose any Apex class. It'll pull up everything that implements the queuable interface, or the schedulable interface. In this case, there's still provides some global method or global class that does that, it looks like. Then you can specify when you want this to run. So normally what happens is you schedule your schedulable job. And again, an administrator can do this. So the good thing is you have to write your code, then you just hand it off, and then the client can really own this and own monitoring. Like, all that's for free. You don't have to do anything. So as a developer, it's really nice because you're kind of off the hook a little bit. As long as your code is written good and doesn't fail and you know all those things. But normally what you would do is schedule a class, and that schedulable will probably invoke a batch job, and then the batch job will go do all the work. So you normally would combine those together. So the batch job is also driven by an interface. Okay. Let me see. And then the process batch. Okay. So here's an example of a batch job. So there's a couple of things. So it implements the database.batchable. And then I'm not really sure all the types that you can use here. I've only used it with SObject, and that's the only example I've ever seen in the documentation. And so the way that this works is it requires you to have a start method, an execute method, and a finish method. So what happens is you create a new instance of your class, calling a constructor. You can do some logic here if you need to. And then when you tell Salesforce to run your batch job, first it'll call your start method once, and it will use a query locator, right? So it's going to query the database, but it's doing it in an efficient way. And then you pass it in a query that's a string. So you're passing in a dynamic query. So in your constructor, you can build some dynamic query if you need to use, you know, the caller of this to be able to, you know, dynamically figure out some things. But a lot of times your query might just say, hey, grab everything where the date is less than or equal to yesterday. Like maybe once a month, you need to process, you know, all the previous months something, you know, orders or invoices or something. Okay, so it'll call the start method exactly once. And then it will call the execute method multiple times. So the default batch size for this is 200 records. But when you call this, you can set the batch size. So you can set it to 1 or 10,000. Okay, so the reason why you might want to set it to 1 is if you're doing really, really, really heavy operations that take a lot of processing. So sometimes, like, you need to amend contracts and create quotes automated and then order those. And there's a lot of asynchronous stuff happening. You know, your batch size, you might have to set it to 1 so that you can do all that stuff. Okay, so it'll call execute many times. Okay, at least once. And then when it's done, it will call the finish method once. So start and finish get called once. So really, all you have to do is implement this interface, add a little bit of code, and then in your execute method, you can just do whatever business logic you want. And it's a best practice to call off the helper methods to do all your business logic so that you can share code and so that when someone looks at this, it's pretty contained. So Okay, and then when the execute method is called, there's this batchable context, which I've never used, so you probably won't need to use that, but if you need to get information about the job that's running, you can. But then it passes in a list of objects here, and this is based on the query that you provided. So you, as the caller of this, needs to determine this. And this can be S-object if maybe you're doing a really dynamic query that could work across multiple objects. But that's not usually the case. Okay, and again, there's a lot of documentation and examples of this all over the internet. So just know that these things exist, and when a use case comes up, you should be able to figure it out. It's not very hard.
I have a question.
Sure.
Those kind of processing seems to be good to do integrations with another system. Why we are using MuleSoft? For example, I'm using the streaming API, and creating extra objects to do those kind of integrations. Why? Do you know? Sure. Why? I think this is seems to be a better option.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good option. So we're writing code. The platform's a little bit limited. So depending on how complex your data transformations need to be, it can be a little bit tricky. So those are the types of questions that we help a lot of clients deal with. Like, what should you do? You know, a lot of times clients have decisions on, we're already using this middleware platform, we want to continue to use that. And then there's a lot of cases where there might not just be one system that you're talking to, but there might be a whole bunch. So where do we want all the business logic to live, or all the transformation logic to live, or all the transportation logic to live? And so creating a bunch of point-to-point integrations in Salesforce is, you just have to make that decision. But with a lot of large enterprises, we see that middleware is very popular. And Zeke, maybe you have something to say on that too.
Specifically with Atlassian?
Yeah, in Atlassian we are using MuleSoft. And MuleSoft, it is subscribing to a push topic that is a kind of push notification that Salesforce sends when you create an object, for example. And then we're injecting in a message broker. We are doing a REST call to a message broker, and the message broker is just spreading the message to the internal Atlassian system.
And that message broker is Hydra, right?
No, it's a stream. Hydra is,
yeah. So I would actually echo what Austin is saying, right? It's the point-to-point integration, right, becomes very cumbersome when you have multiple different technologies you're working in. Right, we showed you the monetization ecosystem and the 18 different blocks in there, right? Salesforce isn't always all of those blocks, and it's not just Salesforce and another technology. So when it's not just the communication between Salesforce and that other technology, and you're relying on multiple sources to aggregate a single source of data, right? It's good to have an aggregator and then to perform the transformation there and spread the data out to whatever systems that need to pull from it at that time.
Yeah, maybe that's the case.
Yeah, but
because you might get billing information in specifically from Atlassian from what's the billing system? HAMS, right? So there might be some data in HAMS that's sitting, and there might be some data within Salesforce that's sitting, and you need to put that all down to your financial system, right? So if it's there, you kind of lose track with your point-to-point integration. Where do you kind of combine all that data?
Yeah, maybe that is the case.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other areas on the platform we haven't talked about. So there's the streaming API, that's one option. You could also use outbound messages to tell another system, hey, this data changed, here's that data, or something like that. In addition to that, there's something called platform events, which are like the streaming API, except they allow you to just publish any arbitrary event and then send a notification out to anyone that's subscribing to that event. So it's just like a totally custom event framework that Salesforce gives you. That's a fairly new feature. So, there's a lot of features of the platform. There's a lot of things that at one point were different and they've been adding over time. So, all of our clients, a lot of them have been longtime Salesforce users. Very rarely do we see a brand new Salesforce customer. So, you know, when you get on a project, there's a lot of like decisions about what to do, how many hours do we have to do it in, what's the scope of the project, you know, how big is the team, you know, there's lots of stuff at play. Cool. All right, we are. Any other questions on asynchronous? Oh, unit tests. Okay. Yeah, unit tests are really hard. Salesforce doesn't really make them any easier. I mean, they have some nice things, but they're one of the really challenging things. All right, so imagine that we have custom code that we have written that when an amendment subscriptions are created, we need to maybe make a call out to an external system, or we need to do some stuff, maybe send some emails out to some people. And by the way, Salesforce has an email service that you have access to in Apex. You know, so those use cases are really easy. Okay, but if you can think about Zeke's diagram that he showed on an amendment, or maybe a renewal would even be a good example, but you remember all the objects that are there, right? When your unit test runs, it runs without any data in the database. So all the things that we did through clicking, we have to create all that data just so that it's in the database, just so that we can invoke our code to make it happen. You know, make our code be fired. So account, contacts, opportunities, opportunity products, quotes, quote lines. In addition to all the logic that SteelBrick has, we have to create data that looks and operates like those data sets do. And then we have to create a contract and subscriptions, and then we have to create a renewal opportunity, a renewal quote lines, renewal, you know, opportunity products. Some of that might be automated in triggers because we're just using Apex, so DML is happening.
And there is no mocking framework.
So there is a couple of things. There is like a stub, a mock. I should probably
well, but you can.
There are some things, but they're complicated and they don't work very well. Okay. So let me figure out what it was called. Yeah, there's the stub API that's fairly new, and I haven't seen any good implementations on it. You know, and this is not my strong area. I haven't done a lot of stuff with building really complex unit test frameworks before. You know, so Salesforce has a stub API. That's one option. They also provide some other options where we haven't seen it yet, but there's something called a static resource. That's where you can upload files, and then you can access those files in Apex. So you can upload a CSV that can have data, and then there's an API in Apex that you can read that data, and it will create that data from the CSV. But it's really limited on relationships. And as you guys heard when I just talked about all those objects, there's a lot of relationships we have to deal with. So there's also a few libraries that are out there to deal with this. And there's one other pattern that's available that I've used in some cases. Okay. So in some cases, I had some stuff that was dealing with invoice lines, and I was running into a lot of issues with limits. I was running into limits just trying to create on the database before my code even ran in my unit test. Just the data creation, I was hitting a ton of limits. So when you get into billing, you have to create a whole bunch. You have to create revenue schedules and billing rules and tax rules. You know, there's a whole bunch of extra stuff that you just have to create. And so what we did is we used dependency injection so that we could test our code without even going to the database at all. Okay. So what we did is we just created an interface where anytime that we had to do any database interaction, including access a formula field, because formula fields are read-only, So you can't mock a formula field. You can't say like account dot whatever that formula field that we created. We can't set that to a value. It'll fail immediately as soon as we as soon as that that line of code is executed. So we created this interface that anytime that we had to do a query, save a record, or access a formula field, we created methods so that that stuff is abstracted out of our class. And then in our unit test, we can provide a mock implementation of this interface where we can just pass fake records. And when you need to access a formula field, you can just pass any value, to simulate your data in various states. So this is an example of what I've done fairly recently to try to get around some of the complexities. So it takes a lot to build this framework up, but when you write your unit tests, they run a lot faster because there's no dependency on the database. You don't catch like all the end-to-end stuff because none of the other automation actually runs because it never hits the database. So you're literally testing your unit of code. Like, given these inputs, am I getting these outputs? It's very specific. So you won't catch some of the bugs, but you'll be able to test just the logic on your code. Assuming that your assumptions on the input are correct, because a lot of times there's a lot of automation, so it's hard to know exactly what your data is going to look like in every case. But that's something that you can do. So I think we're short on time, so I'll just show an example of a unit test here. Oh man, I don't know if we have. Oh, I can probably find a simple one. Okay. Classes. Okay, actually testing a Visualforce page here. So this will just show an example. So what we'll do is we won't actually really even look at the logic that this is testing, just so you can see how you would write a unit test. So number one is on your class, you need to specify that this is a unit test by using this @isTest annotation. What that'll do is that'll make it so that this code can't be invoked from regular production. And when it's calculating your test coverage, it'll make sure that this class doesn't count against your code coverage. And also there's a limit to how much Apex you can have in your org. These classes won't count against that. So if you have a helper method that's just created, that's like a test utility, you would mark that as a test, even though there's no test methods in there, so it doesn't count against your limits. Okay. So then we have these methods here. So these are the unit tests that run. We have this @isTest. So if we wanted to, we could do something like this, right? So it doesn't have to be inline. They're static. They're required to be static methods. And so what happens is when we run this unit test, Salesforce will just call each one of these methods. And then in here, all I'm doing is I'm creating a new instance of some controller. This is a Visualforce controller. So I'm creating this, and then I'm calling a method to create accounts. And then I'm using the system.assert. So what we have available is system.assert, just takes in a Boolean. We have assert equals and assert not equals. So those are just the three things. It's really simple. There's not a lot of bells and whistles, but it's really easy to understand how it works. And then the way that this works, I'm not sure what frameworks you guys use, and I don't know what the standard is. But the way that this works is the value that you're expecting, you put first.
Yeah, it's
the opposite. Backwards, yeah. Okay, that's what I thought too, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you put your expected case first, and then whatever you're testing second. The reason why you don't have to follow that order, but when a test fails, it'll say we expected this value, but we got this value. So if you do it opposite, then it'll be opposite in the notes, but you'll still be able to kind of figure it out. Okay, and so normally, what you'll do is you'll call some code. You probably need to re-query code. So maybe you have a trigger that's creating a whole bunch of related records. After that, you probably want to query the database to say, okay, were those records created? And did the values get set to what I expect them to get set to? Okay, so this is just a simple example. So you're not required to have good tests. You're just required to have code coverage. So let me show you how code coverage works. So this org, let me see if I can open this. This is the an org I use for training. I don't know if it's going to work. Oh, there we go. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run these unit tests, and I'm going to show you how that process works. Okay. So just like we always do, we're going to use the developer console to aid interacting with Salesforce. Okay, so you can run your unit tests right from Sublime, which is normally what I do. On Mac, there's a keyboard shortcut, but on Windows, and I would guess Linux, there's not for some reason. Okay, by the way, you can, I have code open here in the developer console, and you can change the theme. So, all right, so I'm just going to close these. Okay. All right, so we have the test menu up here, so we can choose new run. When you do that, it'll show all your unit tests here. And this is the unit test that we looked at before. So you can run just one method if you want, or you can run all the methods. So it depends how, if you're troubleshooting just one method, you might want to keep running that method, you know, as you're trying to make it pass. Okay, I'll go ahead and run all these methods. There's a checkbox in the menu that says run tests asynchronously. And I recommend having that checked. So when that's the case, you'll be able to come down here to this tests tab. You can open that up. It'll show you each method. And if you click on it, if there were errors, it would show here. It would show a stack trace. And then you can double click on this if you're running multiple tests, then you can double click on that. But you can go to the log, so you also have the log of when the unit test ran. Okay. So if we click here, we can see I was going through the same trigger activity with some students. This was a training word that I was using. Okay. So we can see that our unit tests, it'll aggregate all of them into this one log. So that's why it's really easy to get above your 2 megabyte stop log size in unit tests. Okay, so we see that that's there. So on our test tab, we can come look over here, and this is our account creator controller. I think this is what we were testing. We can click on it, and let me, I don't know what the default theme is. I'll just leave this one. So normally the coloring's a little bit better on the default theme. But what it does is it'll show which lines of code are covered. So this can be really handy when you're trying to troubleshoot your code coverage. So this shows here that these lines were covered. Sorry, I can't read anything on the screen. But if we scroll down, then we can see, oh, we were handling exceptions, but we didn't handle that case. And sometimes it might be impossible to make an exception case get thrown. Like, you know, sometimes there's no way to stage data in that way. And then we didn't test that. Okay. And so if you run the test from Sublime, I'll go ahead and run the test. And I think in Maven's Mate, unit testing, and then you can say run. And this will just run all the methods. That'll show you the results here, which is handy. But then also, as it's running, I'm going to run it one more time. Okay, that should just pop up here, and you can view the status here. Sometimes they can take a really long time to run. These are running really quick. But then every time it runs, it recalculates code coverage. And the recalculation of code coverage is really what takes a long time, because if there's a lot of dependencies. Again, there's a lot of trailheads on how to write unit tests, so it's just one of the things that you're going to have to learn. When you deploy code, so normally we deploy code from like dev to UAT to production. You know, we have some instances, some environments. So it's not required that your unit tests are passing to go from dev to UAT, but it's a best practice. They give you the option to run your unit tests as you're going through that process, but you can skip running unit tests. It's a best practice to always run your unit tests. Make sure that you have passing code coverage before you go to UAT or whatever the staging environment is right before production. But sometimes you're a little behind on a feature, and so you might, you know, push and then do the unit test later, and then deploy those. So, and there's, yeah, hopefully you guys in the beginning have people to help you with deployments. They're not very hard, but there's some nuances that take a little while to get the hang of. So it's good to have someone that's done that a lot, you know, help other people learn. All right, so looking at these topics here, what topics? We have 13 minutes. Are there topics you guys want to cover? We talk about Lightning, talk about HTTP, we can talk about Visualforce.
Yeah, Visualforce, I think I can take this.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll show the training example because that one is really, really, really easy. So a couple notes here. Visualforce is the MVC design, or design paradigm. So we have you know, HTML page, we have a controller. We can also use a standard controller where we can get some stuff for free. And then Lightning, on the other hand, is a different paradigm. It's a front-end JavaScript framework. Okay, so your code's in JavaScript. You'll have a controller in JavaScript, a helper method in JavaScript, and then you'll have a component, which is just one small part of the page. And you compose these components together if you want to build an application. Like Process Builder probably has, I don't know, 50 components. Or so. I'm just making up a number, but it has some number of components to compose that page. Okay, and then there's the Lightning design system. Have I showed you guys that yet?
No.
Okay. So I'll show you that, and then I'll jump into Visualforce. So Salesforce has, so we have Lightning, but we also have the Lightning design system. This is an open source CSS framework that you can use in any application you want. It's not tied to Salesforce. So FuseKit, for example, would have been, I probably should have done this. And I started to, but it was a little bit more beta at that point. So I'll just show you an example of a couple things here. So we haven't really been using the Lightning experience, but I recommend that you become familiar with it. But the Lightning design system is just a CSS framework. So you can pull this library into your code. There's no JavaScript included. So you have to implement all the JavaScript to change, like update the CSS classes to make your code interactive. So here's an example. We have a card with a header and a footer. You know, maybe if there's like a data table in your card or tiles or something like that. Yep, so here's nested cards. So this is the Salesforce Lightning design system. Okay, so Lightning is built on this, but this is the open source component, not the whole framework, just the CSS part. So if you like web development, then you should probably come check this out. Okay, Lightning design system. All right, so I will show you an example here. Let's see. Let me go find one of these pages. Okay. Account creator. All right. So Visualforce, the way that this works is we have, you create what's called a Visualforce page. And that page is structured just like HTML, except it uses these other tags. So your page has to open with an apex::page, and then end with the that block. Sorry, it's covered down here, but it was this. It was the closing tag. Okay. So the best thing to do this. I mean, it's pretty complex, but if you just search for one of the tags, any one of the tags, it'll pull up the documentation, and then you can browse and find out what the other tags are. Okay. So I'll just show the documentation really quickly. So Apex page, this shows what the page is. Sometimes they'll give you an example of what this turns into. So this is all rendered by the Visualforce engine, or processed by the Visualforce engine. It generates regular HTML and passes that to your browser. Right? So your browser can't read these tags; they're not valid HTML. So you'll navigate to the documentation, and it'll let you know what attributes are available for this tag. Action, API version, all these things here. So as we saw, we have these tags here. One pretty cool thing is you can do content type. You can set that to PDF. So you can create things here that when you view it, it actually renders that as a PDF. So you create like, you know, an invoice template or a quote template or something like that.
It's very similar to ASP.NET or the old-fashioned and the JSP.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the young people doesn't know that,
but I'm sure this all goes back to JSP, because that's, you know, if you look on Salesforce, you might have noticed JSP in the URL on occasion. So, right. So everything. So you can use standard HTML here, but you know, there are some things that you would do here. Let me see if I have an example. Okay. Render. So there are some attributes like re-render. What re-render does, it allows you to re-render parts of the page using JavaScript instead of doing a full page refresh. So it's really easy. Salesforce abstracts that all away from you. So this Apex command button, we'll put a button that's styled just like the save and clone, all those buttons we've been interacting with all week. And if you add the re-render attribute, you pass in the ID or a comma-separated list of IDs of the elements on your page that, hey, when this is clicked, just re-render this component instead of a full page refresh. But if you're using spans and divs, you can't use the IDs from those objects. It has to be an Apex :tag enabled to re-render. Let's see if I have any. Nope. So if you need to create a span or a div, they have a tag that's called Apex panel. And that would turn into, by default, it turns into a div, span. But then I think there's a layout attribute, and you can say block or something like that. I might be getting it backwards, but then it would turn into a div. So it's recommended that, actually, you probably won't like that. I think it's called output panel, not panel. But you would use those instead of spans and divs. So it's kind of annoying in some cases, but it's really powerful for creating interfaces. So this particular page has a controller. So there's two things. We have a standard controller. Actually, I probably have a better example of a standard controller, so I'll hold off on that. So this controller, this is the one that the unit test was for. Okay, it looks like I made some stuff private, but I made it available to the unit test. Okay. So in this case, we have this controller. Okay, you guys can probably guess what this is, but it's a kind of a funky syntax.
Yeah.
So if you want to add a getter and setter, Salesforce has this shorthand. You can just do get and set.
I have to say
Let me guess.
The same that C#.
Oh, okay.
Exactly the same.
Not surprised. That's been a recurring thing. Okay. So then if you want some more complex logic in your getter or setter, then instead of just get semicolon, you can add some stuff here. So in this case, we have a Boolean value, but we're dynamically setting what the getter function returns.
And what is when you define a set?
Mm-hmm.
How is the parameter? How is the value of the parameter that you are assigning to?
I don't remember.
It is value.
I think it's value.
Totally equal to.
Okay,
equal to
probably
zero.
value. Yeah, so I'm not really a C# developer, so yeah, I'm fairly certain it's value. Okay, so the way that a controller works is it just the Visual Force engine will automatically render your controller, and then you can specify variables. You can specify methods. Any method where you want. Anytime you're pressing a button, you have to return a page reference object. And this is so that if you want to redirect the user, you can. But generally, you would return null if you want to stay on the same page. But this says, hey, this action should refresh the page when I'm done, so that it will update any changes that were made. So you can use the re-render if you don't want a full page update with just certain parts. Okay, and then to interact with this data, you probably already noticed, but we use this curly bracket exclamation mark syntax. Okay, so similar to a lot of other templating engines, it's a similar paradigm. So if you want to pass parameters to a method, you actually have to go through a JavaScript intermediary. So you have to create, there's a special tag you can use that's like apex : I think it's action function or something like that. And that will, on the fly, generate JavaScript, like load that into into JavaScript, and then you can call this method. You can call your method, and then that JavaScript you can call back to your Apex class and pass in parameters. Mm-hmm. There's also something called JavaScript remoting. JavaScript remoting allows you to add annotations to an Apex class that says remote resource, and the Visual Force engine will automatically add those classes to you to the global JavaScript namespace. And then in JavaScript, you can call methods in your Apex controller right from JavaScript, so you can create more interactive pages. Okay. All right. So. All right, so we looked at this controller. There's also something called the standard controller, and there's something called the controller extension. So let me see if I can find my other. Here we go. Pages. Let me see if I have any standard controller pages. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I have this day 14 Visual Force page. This page uses the standard controller. What that means is that when this page is called, you have to specify a query parameter that has ID equals and then the account ID. And then it adds a variable called account to this page. And so you can interact with that record without ever writing any code. All your logic can be in here. So hang on one moment here. I can. So the one thing we haven't seen is, all right, we looked at the code, but how do we actually invoke these pages? There's a few ways to do that. Open Salesforce. Okay, so I'm going to show you the most basic way. So first off, I have to grab an account ID so that our code will run. Don't worry about the name on this account. Let me find a good account that actually has some data for them. Actually. Okay. So the most basic way to access a page, and maybe you noticed this in the URL when we were on the quote line editor with Stillbrick, but Apex. And then you can type in the name, day 14. Let me see if that's the right page here. Okay, so just in the URL Apex, day 14 Visual Force page. Oh, it looks like we have an ID here. Okay, so I use the standard controller, so it'll automatically parse the query parameters, provide you with the ID, and then you have this, whatever the object name is, you have that'll be the variable name. If it's a custom object, it'll still be the exact name with the __C.
Yeah.
In addition to that, you also have access to related records. So you would have access to you could loop a subquery to get all the contacts without ever writing any code, without even doing the query. Like that's provided by Salesforce for you. So this is a really simple example where we showed this. Now where we had this. All right, let me show you one more quick example here. Okay. I'm just going to show off a little bit here. It's actually what I'm going to do. All right, so we have this company, one of our clients, Jukin Media. If you have a YouTube video that goes viral, they buy that video from you, and then they sell rights to that video to media companies, and then you get paid a royalty.
Nice.
Yeah, they're really not nice people to work with, but so they had this requirement where when they wanted to have one quote line and one invoice line, but they wanted to say that this quote line was for buying rights to these 20 videos. And we needed to know exactly what videos they were so that we could keep track, so that when they paid their invoice, we could pay royalties out to the clip owners. Okay, so that's a common situation. If I'm buying 100 videos, I don't want to have to add 100 quote lines and figure out what each video is. So I'll show you what I built for them. This is actually all built in React. It's compiled down using Webpack into one JavaScript file. It's uploaded as a static resource, and then it's rendered as in a Visualforce page. So it's pretty slick. And it uses Visualforce remoting. And I was able to mock everything out and run it locally without running it on Salesforce, so the development cycle was really quick. So this is the standard quote line editor. So you can add, as you saw, you can add buttons up here to the top. But in addition to that, you can have icons that are links. So I'm going to click on this. So notice when I click on this, it's calling out to this Apex page that's called Associate Video to Quote Lines, okay? So this page, this is using the Lightning Design System. This isn't using the Lightning framework. This is all just written in JavaScript and HTML, but I'm using the CSS framework. Okay, so there's a few different paradigms depending on exactly how you want to build. This is a Visualforce page that happens to run a React app. So it's not using the Lightning framework, which is a whole JavaScript front-end framework that's a little bit different. So here, the user can type in a name, can do a search. They can also type in the IDs of the videos here. And then from here, we search, and it shows a list of all the videos. Okay, and this video isn't available to add. But from here, the user can say, oh, I want to add these videos, or these are the videos that I'm selling. Okay, and then their quantity is only 4, so we provide a message to them if it exceeds that. Okay, and then there's like a filter here that in real time as they're typing. Okay, so now we have these videos. They're selected here, and there's this little button here that says, oh, actually, I meant to sell them 10 videos. The user can type in 10, and what's happening is it's calling an Apex class. That Apex class is doing an update. It's doing a SQL query and then an update on the quote line to update the quantity. So in the background, even though we're not there, it's interacting with that. So now we can add more videos. And they allow them to sell the same video multiple times, because if they want, their customers want to show the video on Facebook and show it on Twitter and show it on TV, each one of those they have to buy rights for that individually. So, and sometimes they say, I'm buying 20 videos, but I don't know what videos I'm buying yet. And so later down the road, we have to figure that out. So there was a lot of complexities around that use case. Okay, so from here, we're aggregating these. Now once we hit save, this modal pops up, and it says we're adding these new videos. Because what could happen is later, as they're negotiating the quote, they could come back and change the videos that they want. So it would show which ones were unchanged, which ones were deleted, and which ones we're adding. So now when we save that, it navigates us back to our quote line. So what we did is we created a custom object that was, so we have our video library, we have our quote line. We created a custom junction object that is the association of a quote line to the video. So we're just creating those records. So now we have this little indicator here, and the icons are ugly because Stillbrick doesn't really provide flexibility to change the size on these, unfortunately. But this shows here that we've declared 10 videos. So now if I go back into this page, we have these videos, and there's this little icon saying, okay, this one's already saved. If we remove some of those, now hit save, it'll show what's going on here. And I probably have, yeah, so if we open, I can show you some code real quick here. Okay, so a remote action, all we do is specify this remote action, and then on our Visualforce page, I forgot exactly how that was set up. Yeah, this is our Visualforce page, and okay, so this is how I included the static resource in the page. And we specified the controller as the page that had our remote actions. So Salesforce automatically injects to the global namespace an object that's named what our class name was, and all of our methods that were remote methods on that class. So now, they have asynchronous ways that we can call those methods and interact with it. So that's called JavaScript remoting. So yeah, but if you're using Lightning, then everything's in JavaScript, and so it's a different paradigm. But if you want to build interactive JavaScript pages that are in Visualforce, there's a lot of stuff available to do that. So yeah, this is the whole Visualforce page. This is all that it looks like, but it's loading in this resource, which is a minified compilation of all the JavaScript resources. So that was probably one of the more fun things, visual things that I've worked on. All right, well, we're at time. I think there's plenty of stuff we didn't get to, but I hope you guys have a lot more knowledge today than you did on Monday. Yeah, and again, you guys are, I think you guys should all have my email address. I emailed you out some stuff. You're more than welcome to email me questions as they come up. If you guys need guidance on what trailheads you should do or what things you should do for learning, I'm more than happy to give you guidance on that. I'd really like to find ways that we can integrate our teams together. So at ATG, we spend a lot of time learning and teaching each other and trying to help pull junior resources up so that everyone's better. And I think there are some really interesting things we could do around having you guys attend some of our trainings, or working together on coming up with some systems so we can all grow and make lots of money and do lots of cool things and have lots of work.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Justin, where is he? He popped around the corner. Italian. Que caso viene, amigo.
Great. Do you have any words of wisdom?
Yeah, no, for me, it was really great to come down here and meet all you guys in person. So I'm really looking forward to, seeing you guys on projects and, looking to see how you guys grow with ATG. So really happy that, this class has happened. The one thing I think we want to know, did you confirm with Justin when we were going to send out the assessment?
No, we haven't.
Okay.
It's going to be next week.
Yeah, early next week we'll see an assessment come out with a whole bunch of questions about what we have. So don't forget over the weekend. And again, feel free to reach out to us at any point in time. We're really more than happy to come help anyone and reiterate some things that we taught you guys today, or if you guys want to start teaching us stuff, we'd like to learn as well. So teach us things too. All right?
Okay. Cool. How about dreams?
Oh, yeah. We're staying until Tuesday. Es martes, nos vamos. Justin se va mañana. Yeah.
Stay here in Santa Fe.
No, Buenos Aires. Yeah.
Become your family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to say like you mentioned about something.
Yeah.
That's the thing that was
Yeah.
At least I need to tell you.
Well, that's it, guys. Nothing else.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
For
Thank
taking
you
the
guys for
time.
all your week.
No. We are here all the time, so you have to travel here and spend a lot of hours.
Did you like Santa Fe or?
Yeah, we loved it. Beautiful city.
Yeah.
No.
You don't have a lot of fun to do here, but
Oh, we kept ourselves busy. I did some gambling yesterday at the casino.
Oh, yeah.
And I won 200 pesos.
Yeah, well, thank you for your time all week. I know it's probably been difficult to schedule this much time away from projects.
Yeah. It was bad.
This one.
We appreciate that you take the time to teach us. And well, Nacho, ¿quieres decir alguna palabra en nombre de todos?
No, well, what you just said, I think it has been a pleasure to have you here, guys, to get to know you personally. I knew all of you at some point in my life on the other side of the screen, so it's we should be used to this, like in the 21st century, but it's not always easy to get people that you work and that are so far away.
Yeah.
I don't know how many miles, but I know how much time. So if I measure my time, it's 30 hours. 30 hours. So that's what the guys, eso es lo que les tomó a ellos 30 horas en llegar hasta acá y otras 30 horas para volver. El esfuerzo es muy grande.
Yeah, I know.
But we are really thank you for the effort on coming here. And I think, well, I am speaking in behalf of everyone, but I have seen every one of the people here really engaged with the training. We were a little bit skeptical at the beginning because of the configuration part, but once you see the scope, because that's what happened to Cesar and myself, once you see the scope that the platform has, what you can do, and the problems that you get to solve, that's really amazing. And I think everyone here has discovered that. Although we know it was a crash course, and there is much more to learn, this was really good. So thank you again.
Thank you guys. Thank you guys.
Y gracias a todos por haber estado, y sé que dejaron muchas cosas de lado personal.